Okay, good afternoon, everybody. We are starting. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening out there. There are people talking in here. It's great, great conversations. I've been ordered to start right now, so we are going to start. It's really a pleasure to open and chair the afternoon session. And our first speaker is Jeff BIGHAM, who has recently moved to CMU and is going to tell us about all of his amazing work engaging humans and in hybrid architectures with computation to do useful things.
All right, well, thanks, Seth, and thanks all of you for coming back from lunch to hear me speak. So for the past few years, my group and collaborators and I have been creating what we call crowd-powered access technology. So this is technology that we can deploy, which is very intelligent because we're actually bringing in the on-demand intelligence of people that we draw from the web into the technology itself to make it more reliable, more intelligent, to do things that we can't yet do with computation alone. And so the motivation, which I really am going to breeze through because I think it just repeats a lot of what we heard from earlier today from James and others. There's a lot of great access technology out there in products and also under development. If you look at the things that are most reliable, they tend to have some problems, though, and that's kind of what led us in this direction. So the problems that we are really interested in is that most of the automated technology out there has a pretty limited scope, right? So you can, as we saw earlier, you can build very reliable OCR technology as long as what you're OCRing is a very high resolution, good photograph of text. It tends to have some unacceptable error rates in practice. Often it's very expensive, and sometimes it's not exactly what users want. And sometimes I think that we don't even know exactly what our target end users really want because we're driven as much by what technology we can imagine building as what a real end user need is. And so that led us kind of to this other approach. So this idea of crowdsourcing access technology, the access technology that we wish we had, that we wish we could build with computation alone. And so I want to talk a lot about, at least to start, this project that we actually developed starting here at MIT and Rob Miller's group called VizWiz, which is an iPhone application that lets blind people take a picture, speak a question they'd like to know about that picture, any question they like, and then get answers back from people out on the web to that question. And we do a lot of magic behind the scenes to make sure those answers come back pretty quickly, so between 30 seconds and a minute. We released this technology, and I thought instead of describing myself how it works, I would let Justin Romack here, who is a blind blogger, describe how it works, kind of show you how it works. He independently created this video, and I think it's pretty great, so I thought I would just show that instead of trying to describe it myself.
I'm going to do a quick demonstration of VizWiz for the iPhone. Well, it's really for iOS, but I have an iPhone 4. I'm going to show you a couple common household things that I tested VizWiz today with tested VizWiz with today, and I just wanted to kind of show you some of the results. I'm pretty impressed. So I've got my thermostat here, and I've set it way down, and I'm going to take a picture here. So place this, move it back a little bit, take a picture, and I'm going to record my question. What does this thermostat say? I have some options as to what sources I'm going to pull the results from. I'm going to select web workers and IQ engines, and so I'm just going to go ahead and send. Please wait while your question is sent. So it's going to send my question. So web workers will actually pull information from human sources. IQ engines, I imagine, pulls it from image databases, somewhat like Google Images. You also have the option to pull results from social networks. I think Twitter is the only option here now, but on the website for the application, they talk about Facebook being an option. So let's see, it already has some answers available. The IQ Engines has it labeled as a thermostat, so we knew that. That doesn't do me too much good if I wanted to get a temperature reading. So if we just hold on here for a couple more seconds, earlier I got a result probably within 45 seconds, so just hang tight here. It did identify the temperature earlier. 71 on the right. I don't know which is the current temp and which is the setting. Web worker. Okay, a web worker said that 75 is on the left and 71 is on the right. They're not sure what the current temperature is. I can tell you that 71 is what I have it set at, and 75 is the current temperature. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right. So we have 2 pairs of eyes that say that that's correct. So that was pretty quick. Let's go back. I'm going to go back to the...
All right, so I just wanted to point out a few things about that video. First of all, no matter how many times I watch that video, I'm still worried that VizWiz isn't going to work and an answer isn't going to come back. Since it's a video, it usually works. The other, I think that maybe if you haven't seen how a blind person takes a photo, that's a kind of interesting video. So you notice that the person held, Justin there, held the phone up to the thermostat and then kind of moved back so that he could capture the thermostat. You also notice that the first answer he got back was thermostat, which didn't relate to his question. And so that is, as he kind of described there, that is a kind of a human/computer vision powered object recognizer. So that's kind of the best case for that kind of a system. It's going to be able to say, this is a thermostat, but not interpret your natural language question as humans can. And I think what's really interesting about that particular answer that he got back is that it didn't just try to answer the question, it actually expressed some uncertainty in that answer. So they said it was 71 and 75. They weren't actually sure which one was the current temperature. And that's something, again, it's something that's very human to be able to say, I'm not sure, but here's some information that maybe can help you make sense of what the right answer is. And so I think that's really interesting. So we released this VizWiz on the Apple App Store, and you can go out and actually download it yourself if you'd like, over 2 years ago. And so since then, we've had about 6,000 people ask a little over 70,000 questions. The answers have come back in less than a minute. This is free to users. It costs us something around 5 cents per question, which we've been funding so far. And I thought I would just take a minute here to show you just a few of the kinds of questions we get asked. If I can not show my email, instead show. Definitely worked before. Let me try one more time. There it goes, I think, if it shows up on there. Yes, okay. So this web page shows just a subset of 1,000 anonymized, anonymous questions. And I thought I'd go through a few of them because I think it's kind of interesting. It kind of gets us past this idea of, what can our technology do, and gets us more looking at what do people actually want to know. So let's see. First question here, and you'll notice this is a picture actually taken by a blind user. It's of a box of medicine, but it's kind of poorly framed. It's the back of the box. It's upside down. And the question is, what medicine is this? And despite those problems with the photo, humans can actually answer this sort of question. Is there a rash on my baby's head? So I don't know. Maybe there is some specialized technology or people working on a baby rash on head detector. But maybe not, and so something general like this can still answer that. Here's an interesting one. So it says, what does this part of the sky look like? And it's kind of a picture of a house and part of the sky. This was one of the earliest questions that we got asked with VizWiz, and so we're very closely monitoring it at the time. And this person asked this question with very similar photos every 5 minutes for about an hour. And we were very worried because we were like, we're paying about 5 cents per question here, and if they keep doing this, we're never going to be able to support the service. Anyway, though, after this hour, this particular user stopped asking these questions, and it turned out we were also monitoring Twitter. And so around the time of this photo, someone tweeted that they had just used VizWiz to watch the sunset. And so it was actually true that over that hour, the sky had gone to light to dark. And so they had watched the sunset with VizWiz. Here is a complicated one. This is a coffee machine with about 1,000 buttons. And they wanted us to describe this interface to them. Kind of gets at the limitation of the model we have where we just kind of send a short text answer back to them. You also notice that there's a credit card over to the left. We get a lot of credit cards despite warning people that whatever photos that they send in get shared out to workers on the web. But credit cards aren't necessarily all that easy to decipher. non-visually, and so people still ask that kind of question. Here's one that's more about fashion. The question is, hi, I would like to know if all my colors go together. I know I have some purples in my shirt, and I want to make sure I have the right pouch on my waist. Thank you. So this kind of gets at this kind of higher level question that people want answered. It's not enough to know just what color are in things. You know, they want more. They want to know more about whether things go together, or fashion-related questions, that sort of thing. Let's see. Here's a how do I cook this? We can't actually answer that question from this photo because it's kind of at the front of the box of this microwavable dinner, and just part of the box is in the frame. And it turns out it took quite a long time. They kept taking different pictures of this box with feedback from the workers. Again, kind of an advantage of using humans is that the humans can kind of say what's wrong with the photo, or what the user might do to improve it. So they might say flip the box over, you might want to move the box to the left, that sort of thing. So finally, they take a photo with the cooking instructions in it, and we're able to answer that question. But it kind of, again, kind of gets at the limits of this kind of approach. Here's an interesting one. So screen readers can make computers accessible, but what happens when the screen reader or the computer crashes and the system is booting up and telling you some kind of warning message? I think this is actually a disk scan. The screen reader is not running, and so the computer no longer talks, and so is no longer accessible. And so we get a lot of pictures of broken computers. And finally, what does this test say? That is a pregnancy test. We have delivered the hopefully happy news at least twice. And so kind of, again, just to get you thinking about, you know, beyond OCR and color recognition and even object recognition and even navigation, there's a whole lot of things that people do in their everyday lives that are not accessible without understanding, without vision. And so I think VisWiz has kind of been a neat lens into that much more diverse set of questions that people want to know about. All right, and so for us, it's also served as a bit of a scaffolding. And so there are problems, obviously, with recruiting people out on the web. They cost money. It's not clear if we had everyone in the world using this that we could scale to it. It's also, even though we try to be pretty quick, it's not real time. And so what we see VisWiz as is more of a scaffold that we can use to deploy a workable system, understand how people might want to use it, and then gradually replace or augment pieces of that workable crowd-powered system with computer vision or other automatic technology where it makes sense. So here, you know, we have this huge corpus of pictures and questions that people want to know about those pictures that are answered by the crowd. We can start using those answers to both understand what kind of computer vision might make sense, and maybe even to use data-driven approaches to start answering those questions automatically. So maybe we can start farming some of these questions out to those approaches, like currency recognition, color recognition, OCR, or new things that we'll develop. We've also used it as a kind of springboard for us to kind of develop the next stage of what you would need if you had a system like this, or you had computer vision that worked really well. So we've, for instance, started working on blind photography, which I'll show just some quick demos of here in a second. So basically, how do you enable people to take better pictures, with one use case being, how do you enable them to take better pictures so that they can get better answers from a service like VisWiz? So here's some examples of combining crowdsourcing and computer vision that I think are interesting. So one of the things that we were interested in is helping blind users find objects in their everyday world. And so this is a supermarket store shelf with a bunch of cereal on it. If you imagine a general system may not know what a particular product looks like. So if the person is interested in Wheaties, what our VisWiz Locate It system would do is basically they take a picture of the whole shelf, they speak the name of the product that they're interested in, that gets sent off to a remote crowd worker who then, instead of answering the question, just draws a box around it, right? And then once you have once you know what that product looks like, what the thing in this picture looks like in that particular location with those particular lighting conditions, the computer vision problem becomes much easier. And so then we send that computer vision descriptor back to the phone, And then that we give them audio feedback to help them find the product on the shelf. And I'll tell you that in the real system, our audio feedback sounded very similar to the funny audio feedback we heard with the left, left, right, right, stay, stay, stay. And but in any case, it worked better because it could give them real-time feedback, which the crowd was unable to do. And then once you find it, maybe use the crowd for something else, like getting details about that product on demand. We've also worked on projects related to blind photography. And so in this case, what the app will do, I'll show a video here in a second, is it will basically select frames out of a streaming video that it thinks are high quality, and it will tell you if it thinks there's anything in that frame that it can identify with computer vision. And so you could use the object recognition as a first step to figure out if your video or if the picture you're going to send is actually a good one, and then ask more details about it to the crowd. So basically, sorry about that. So in this case, they're identifying the different sides of this carton of silk organic soy milk, and then once they find the side that they want, they can send that frame off to the crowd to ask more details, maybe more details about the nutrition facts. So kind of, again, combining something that computer vision may be able to do, which is object recognition, with the crowd's ability to interpret a natural language question. We've also looked at, actually similar to some of the other approaches we saw this morning, extracting frames out of a live video stream that we then stitch together. So if you're asking a question about your bill here from Apple or whoever it is, it might be difficult to capture that entire bill, but if you wave your phone across the bill, extract a few frames, we can then stitch those back together and have it be much more likely that the crowd workers will be able to answer the question based on the photo that you send them. We're also kind of excited about the potential of new technology to make asking and getting assistance easier. So in particular, head-mounted cameras, maybe with Google Glass or other technology, means that you no longer have to hold the camera with your hands. And so we developed a version of VizWiz that works on Google Glass. Here's a quick video of some people trying that, hopefully. I guess I didn't realize how long my intro would be. All right, so this is kind of what it looks like. You'll hear some audio, I think, for the next example.
Okay, glass. Share with. Open glass. Okay, speak. What is this box?
Swipe forward and then double tap.
All right.
I'm coming.
That worked, right?
You can kind of see some of the privacy preserving there. He's kind of whispering to the Google Glass, and the bone conduction headset's telling him what it is. This is a more of a computer vision approach where we've experimented with a sighted person labeling objects in the environment.
This is the laser cutter. Be careful.
And then live real-time recognition that responds to what the person is looking at. And so here the user's going around. He has Google Glass on. And as he goes through the environment, it'll tell him about various things in that environment that have been pre-labeled by a person.
So look right. See Sean Key for information.
It's a little quiet. Power tools, see Sean Kane for
So it's
information.
reading what's in front of you right now?
And it's a see Sean for information.
Exactly.
It's kind of going through a lab with all kinds of crazy equipment in it. Telling you about the 3D printers.
3D printers.
Alright, so now we're gonna come over here. Okay. The laser cutter. Be careful.
And then it found the instructions about the laser cutter, or the user found the instructions about the laser cutter, telling him to be careful. Let's see. So We've also explored live streaming to the crowd, so if you wanted to get kind of real-time continuous feedback, how might you do that? I'm going to zip through this video, but basically you could engage the crowd in navigation scenarios. For time, I'm going to go fast, but basically what this does is it recruits multiple crowd workers who all suggest things that may be interesting for the user to say, and also allows the user to communicate via audio to these crowd workers. And then the crowd selects the best of those responses to send back to the user. So a lot of different ways of essentially engaging the crowd, using computer vision where it works well and can be deployed to make something that we can actually have people use today that can hopefully help people in their everyday lives. So the conclusions, I guess, are I think crowd-powered systems are a pretty interesting way to build a technology that we're all kind of shooting for, but maybe to do it earlier. Maybe it has drawbacks, but maybe that's okay, because as we learn more about what people want via the living laboratory that's created by this deployed technology, we can learn what's most important for the technologies to support, and maybe also learn how to scaffold. Right? So basically, how can we deploy the technology and then gradually have it become automated, as opposed to trying to bootstrap from the bottom and automate everything from the start, which is a very hard thing to do. So that's the end. Thank you very much.
Questions for Jeff?
So do you keep data on the users and how many questions they'll ask? Are there maybe 100 or so power users who really use it significantly, some that use it once and don't use it anymore? Do you have a sense of what that distribution is?
Yeah, so the question is basically the distribution of use across different users. So we do have that information. We have a paper that has a lot of that in detail. I'll say that like a lot of things on the internet, it's basically a power law distribution where a few people ask the most questions, and then there's a long tail of people who ask a few questions. We did look at, in that paper, different contributing factors to abandonment. So for instance, if they were unable to take a quality photo and get a good answer back on some of their first questions, then they're more likely not to use it again. I should also say that we're not assuming that people will use this as an everyday device. It seems to be when people get stuck or when something isn't accessible to them and their normal routine, out of their normal routine, is when they use it, which makes a lot of sense for something new and something that takes a little while to get an answer back.
Very, very nice talk. Could you say a few more words about the live streaming to the crowd? So we are working on navigation. We're thinking, any technical obstacles, like a video streaming.
Right. So I mean, there's a lot of things that crowd can mean. We usually talk about using Mechanical Turk. Mechanical Turk workers, we found, have a generally acceptable connection that you can stream at least some quality of video to. So technically, we use the Adobe Media Server to stream video from the device to the web browsers of each of the crowd workers. It's a little tricky because you have multiple people then receiving it and maybe wanting to comment, and so a lot of our attention has been on how do you actually mediate that. So you have a lot of people that all want to say, hey, do this or do that. What do you actually forward on to the user? And then it's also tricky if you want to use this for, say, addressing rare events. One of the questions we'd love to be able to answer is, tell me when my friend is nearby, but you probably don't want crowd workers or can't afford crowd workers to be viewing a constant video stream just to answer those rare questions when they happen.
Just one more related question about scale. I mean, suppose you did have hundreds of thousands of users and a call center staffed 24/7 with people ready to answer immediately. What are the infrastructure limitations on latency? I mean, how quickly could you actually get answers back to people if they needed them faster than 30 seconds?
So what we've found so far, if you have enough labor and you've invested the time to distribute the questions as they come in to the workers who are free, the biggest problems are how long it takes them to understand the question and answer it, right? And so the quickest we've been able to get down to per question is something like 15 seconds on average, because even if you have a worker available, they still have to look at the photo and they still have to listen to the question potentially. It turns out if you run ASR on that, so if you basically convert the speech question to text, you can drop that time a little bit. And if the question is easy, or at least if it's answerable, which many of these questions are not, the time also goes down.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
All right. Next, I would like to invite Tommy Poggio up. Tommy is a faculty member here, and he's been spearheading this wonderful initiative the last few years about intelligence, how to understand intelligence and biological intelligence, how to understand it, and how to replicate it in machines.
Audio?
Tommy.
Yep. Okay, that's for your audio. Should be coming up. Give it a second. No input. Yeah, unplug it and put it back in again if you can. Okay, there she goes. Okay. Very good. Thanks, Seth. I'm going to give you a brief introduction about this new center Seth referred to. This is the Center for Brains, Minds, and Machines, which was established at the beginning of last September by NSF for the next 5, possibly 10 years. This is a collaboration between MIT and Harvard mainly, with a few other places like Stanford and Rockefeller and UCLA being involved. Our vision is kind of ambitious, is that the problem of intelligence is the greatest problem in science and technology today, that there is work been going on for the last 5 decades, and we start to see the first real progress in products from IBM, Google, Microsoft, and other small companies. But none of these systems is really intelligent, and so there is a need for basic research that pushes the field forward. Example of systems that are as good as we are in narrow domains of intelligence are Watson winning at Jeopardy against human champions, and about 10 years later, Deep Blue winning against Kasparov at chess, and Siri being on the way of being an electronic secretary. And the X-47 took off last year by itself from an aircraft carrier, landed this year by itself. It's a drone on an aircraft carrier. That's probably the most difficult thing for a human pilot to do, landing on an aircraft carrier. There are systems of a partner company of our center. This is Mobileye in Israel, who is making cars see. This is an advertisement from Volvo. You can buy the S60 with this option. It's a combination of a visual system and does pretty useful things. As you can see, it works really. Your car insurance gets reduced if you have the system in the car. This is a vision system that not only passed technical tests, it also passed the lawyer test. These are the main characters involved in this. There are several faculty from MIT and from Harvard, as I said, and a few other institutions. It's a combination of computer scientists, neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, kind of unique in this sense. I'll come back to that in a second. We have also affiliated a number of international partners from the Max Planck Society to the Weizmann Institute to IIT in Genoa, the Italian Institute of Technology. We have some of the main companies who are in the market for intelligent devices, starting with Google and going to smaller companies like Mobileye that I mentioned. And I'll speak mostly about another company by Amnon Shashua, who was a postdoc of mine, student and postdoc, ORCAM. Now, the rationale for the center is that we want to exploit the advances in the last several decades of machine learning, computer science, much more powerful computers and memories, better algorithms, and advances in cognitive science, understanding how intelligence develops in children and what is innate and not, and in neuroscience, how the brain works, recording from neurons, optical techniques. There is an explosion of technologies, and workers in the field of neuroscience. The annual meeting of the Society of Neuroscience happened a few weeks ago in San Diego. There were between 30 and 40,000 scientists attending. One of the core projects that we have that goes towards the goal of understanding intelligence, how the brain produces it, and how to replicate intelligence in a machine. And intelligence means vision, speech, motor control, a lot of what we think is human. In this center, the main project, in a sense, that one that exemplifies what we plan to do is to have a system that can look at the pictures or video, the picture like this one, and can answer questions you can ask about the scene. You can ask what is there, who is this person doing, what these persons are doing with each other, what is this person thinking about this other person. So that's what a person, one of us, can do. He can answer, or she can answer this kind of question. We want a system that can do the same and can do it in a way that fits with the data from the neurons and the activity in the brain of humans that we'll be recording from. So this is kind of our core test at CBM, evaluating how well neural models of the brain can answer this question and how consistent they are with the physiology and the psychophysics of humans. And so our direct interest is not in prosthetics devices, but one of our industrial partners, ORCAM, is actually doing that. And so I'll speak mostly about what they've been doing recently, which is very much in the spirit of this challenge that we have for the center. This is devices to help the visually impaired, and Seth should tell me the slides I should skip because they've been shown already, but I assume you have heard quite a bit already. But this is the ophthalmologist chart and classification of people: normal vision, visually impaired, low vision, legally blind. There are a lot of people that have visual impairment for a number of diseases. Partial list is here, and the most, probably the first one in terms of impact, especially in our rapidly aging societies, is macular degeneration. And macular degeneration, we should have
central vision. Over time, macular degeneration can affect vision by forming a blurred, darkened, or empty area in the center of vision, or distorting one's surroundings, most noticeably in the appearance of straight lines. Macular degeneration may also cause colors to become less vivid. Blurred or distorted central vision can cause an inability to perform tasks that require precision, like driving a car. Fortunately, this disease does not cause total blindness because side vision is not affected.
This is retinitis. It's a kind of tunnel vision, simulation of it. Anyway, there are a lot of people who suffer from this kind of visual impairments. Hundreds of millions, 300 in discount. And of course, simple daily activities become a challenge, like looking around, looking for shops, being careful for cars, reading the newspaper, choosing what to buy, traffic lights, number of buses. And assistive technologies today are not very friendly. Same here. There are things you can do with a smartphone, with OCR. Costs could be in the around $1,000, cheaper than a dog for blind people.
Hold still. Please wait. Send. You're smart. You're motivated. The proposed Startup Visa Act would open the door to foreign entrepreneurs who create jobs by Douglas McMillan, Peter Tedlar, and Combs.
Okay, this is what Orcam does. They started shipping these glasses around now, still to only a 3,000 test people. They will be starting actually selling, I think next year. The price will be around $2,000 or so. It's a camera and a microphone and a processing device developed on purpose. Can do various things. It can read, can recognize objects, places, and faces.
Hi, I'm Liat, and I'm visually impaired. I want to show you today how this device changed my life. Great, let's go there.
Red light. Green light. $50 shekel.
50 shekel. Let's buy some coffee.
Breakfast. Bagel plus coffee with cream cheese, croissant, yogurt, granola, fresh fruit. The Fresh Paint Contemporary Art Fair began 6 years ago and has proved to be a huge success ever since. Dorset, simply delicious muesli, advent of...
Try this one.
Dorset Cobb for high fiber muesli. A really delicious blend of toasted cereals with juicy name raisins, dates, sunflower seeds, toasted coconut and chopped roasted hazelnuts. Of unadulterated breakfast pleasure. Nadal survives rough day in his playground. Paris, Reuters, all seemed as it should be when Rafael Nadal walked onto Chatrier Court to begin his bid for an 8th French Open title, but Daniel Brands ensured it was no regular Monday at the office as the holder survived a big scare. Nadal, as expected. Object learning mode. Please wave product. Thank you. Please record product name.
Pringles onion.
Pringles onion. Push button for adding product. Finished new product learning. Pringles onion.
So the last bit was teaching a new object to the system, to recognize a new object. And one of the most important application is really reading in the wild with you know, papers that may be folded a bit, or street names that are not horizontal or perfectly so under typically conditions more difficult that your typical OCR system has to encounter, and it works very well. It can learn new object, but there is much more to be done in that direction. It comes preloaded with a number of products it will recognize. Let me skip this. Can recognize faces in a small universe of your friend or family. And places too, not only faces. There are some interesting user trials that the company did.
50 shekel.
Ooh! Wow.
Top 5 for the region, although most of their business comes from Brazil, their home country.
Oh, yes!
Now you took it after it stops.
Very good, very good. Again.
You want to do it again?
Top 5 for the region, although most of their business comes from Brazil, their home country, ugly doing business elsewhere. Brown investment as a market for now. This international business is going almost entirely to BTG font too small.
Fantastic! Fantastic!
Okay, here you have some dollars. You want to try to... Can you say what it is?
$50, $50, certo?
50, let's see if it's 50. Yes,
The wall is verde, green, all green. And I put mark color, yellow, green, orange, different notes.
Okay. So let me stop here. As I said, this is ORCAM. I'm on the scientific board, but I don't have a real financial interest in it, so this is not advertisement. This is reporting what's happening there, and all of this is really related very closely to this dream of building an intelligent vision system that will be able, in 5 or 10 years, that's very ambitious, but to describe a scene, not only in terms of answering the first question, what is there, but a lot of the other ones, and throwing some light on how our brain does that. Thank you.
Questions for Tommy? Please come to the mic.
it on? Is it on? Okay. Thanks for the presentation. Very good. I hope you don't mind if I ask a provocative question.
Mm-hmm.
The examples I've seen for ORCAM, and I was familiar with the product from seeing the advertisement on the web and seeing some more interesting videos. It seems that at least the people who try that are not blind. These are person with central vision defect. And I imagine that's probably the customer that is in mind here, because you need to be able to point the finger somewhere. Yep. So the question is, what's wrong with low tech? What's wrong with magnifying glasses and illumination, which is a technique that people have used for many years. It costs much less than $2,000. Now, I imagine that this is just high price because of a quantity. If you drop it, oh well, buy another one. So one thing is, for a blind person who tries to read something, you need to have an automatic system. This system seems really cool and fun. I understand it, but I'm just asking maybe also from a marketing point of view. Thanks.
Well, I think the market will answer your question. But my mother had macular degeneration, and for a little while, magnifying glasses were okay, but then she was unable to read. She could still move around and recognize things and people, but she could not read anymore. And something like that would have been, I think, really great. She died before trying, so I cannot really answer for her, but my guess would have been just the reading part. Your question, I think in terms of recognizing things, and yeah, it may be an kind of overdone, but in terms of reading, I think there is a lot of mileage for visually impaired people, like macular degeneration.
Tell me one more. You said 5 to 10 years at the very end, and I understand that's the lifetime of the NSF funding. But can you, as a scientist, say something about 50 years of vision and what we could realistically expect?
Yeah, so my guess, if I want to be very realistic, I think, what I said, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to clarify this. What I said is very, very ambitious. What I said is very close to saying that we'll solve intelligence in the next 10 years. And I don't think that's possible. Mankind has thought about this since 2,000 years at least. I don't expect to solve it completely, whatever solving completely a scientific problem means, in the next 10 years. What I mean is that I hope in the next 10 years we'll make significant progress, especially in something like the first 3 questions or so that are in the list. We are pretty close to have reasonable answer to the first 2. We have in my lab systems that can recognize objects and can recognize faces very well, probably at the level of humans, and do that in a way that is plausible with various properties of neurons in various parts of the brain. And we are comparing these systems, models, with experiments that physiologists are doing in the monkey and on humans with fMRI and so on. So I feel the first part of recognition is possible within these 5-10 years. Some of the rest, like especially the last question, what happens next? It's tell me a story about the scene. That is really asking for the system to be, a journalist or a writer, and I think that's really a measure of intelligence, but it will take very probably longer than 10 years. On the other hand, I must say that computer vision is going on for 50 years, so artificial intelligence. If you'd have told me 15 years ago that we could have now cars that can more or less drive themselves with vision alone. I'm not speaking about the Google car, which will be a commercial failure and is not what I mean. I mean Mobileye. Google car, by the way, costs more than $100,000, uses very accurate GPS, and the LiDAR active vision system is by itself $80,000. It's not the way you want to go. But vision systems, like Mobileye, those cost probably $100 or less. You know, if they would tell me that there is a car I can brake and it can work, you know, the vision system in, one of the things the vision system does in the car is to detect pedestrians. We had a project in my group 15 years ago to do that. It was a project with Daimler-Benz, Mercedes, and it was one of the first applications of machine learning. We got a system that worked, but work meant one error every 2 frames. So about 15 errors per second, right? Either missed detection or wrong detections. Now, for a scientist, this was very good. For applications, no way. Now, Mobileye has 1 error every 30,000 hours of driving.
We should stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tommy. All right, Pavan. Our next speaker is Pavan SINHA. Our colleague is going to tell us about learning to see late in life.
I do. Okay. We're right on time. So I dedicate this short talk to an exceptional neuroscientist, David Hubel, who passed away just about 2 months ago. Many of us here know what David did, along with his colleague Thorsten Wiesel. Well, the two of them won the Nobel Prize in 1981 for some truly remarkable studies of the visual system. One of the findings, one of the many findings that they had to do with the consequences of visual deprivation on the visual cortex. So this is one of their very famous images. Kittens, soon after birth, immediately after birth, were subjected to varying periods of visual deprivation. The image here corresponds to monocular deprivation. On top, so here you see ocular dominance columns in the primary visual cortex of a normal kitten. The dark and light bands correspond to neural resources that are devoted to the 2 eyes, and they're about in balance. Here is the outcome after just a couple of months of monocular deprivation. The sutured eye has almost completely lost out to the open eye. And this has led to the idea of critical periods, that early on in the developmental timeline, the brain really demands visual stimulation, and if it's denied that stimulation, the consequences are catastrophic. And many scientists, besides Hubel and Wiesel, have confirmed these reports. This is just the tip of the iceberg, that early visual experience is very significant for subsequent visual function. What does this mean for the human condition? So if you have a child like this, who has been blind from birth, is visual learning in such a child going to be compromised forevermore? So if we are able to restore sight in such a child, what are the outcomes going to be? If we extrapolate from the animal work, we would think that the outcome is going to be fairly pessimistic, minimal to nothing. But the truth of the matter is that there are no direct data to really answer this question. We take a risk when we extrapolate from the animal work, both because we are going from animals to humans, and also because the kinds of deprivation regimens that the animals were subjected to are not necessarily exactly the same as the deprivation regimens that blind human children are going through. So we really need data from human children in order to address the question of what are the likely outcomes after many years of congenital blindness. And my students and I have been fortunate to have been able to start and be involved with a project that has begun to provide answers to this question. We call this Project Prakash. Prakash is the Sanskrit word for light. And the idea is that through this work, we are able to hopefully bring light into children's lives. But beyond the humanitarian mission, there's also a complementary scientific mission. So Project Prakash really, at its root, is an effort with twin goals, one humanitarian, one scientific. The humanitarian need can best be described as follows. We want to bring sight to treatably blind children because we know that if they are denied that treatment, then the prospects for their advancement in their lives are very bleak. These are data from India. So for an Indian blind child, the life expectancy on average is 15 years shorter than that for a sighted one. And that for the lucky ones who make it past the first few years alive, childhood mortality is in excess of 50%. That is, less than half of all children born blind live to see their 5th birthday. Less than 10% gain any kind of education, and less than 1% are employed as adults. So our humanitarian mission is to bring sight to children who would otherwise face these kinds of consequences. And let me just show you one example of a Prakash child. You're going to see an 11-year-old girl pre- and post-operatively. Her name is Sumitra. Oops. So in both cases, she has been asked to find a box of chocolates by the side of the corridor. So this is preoperative. Her vision is really just light perception at the moment. And you notice just how much difficulty she's experiencing in finding that box of chocolates. This person that you see on the left is fortunately with us. Where are you, Tapan? Is Tapan here? Yes, right there. Tapan is now a postdoctoral fellow at MIT. And I'll also point out another postdoctoral fellow who's with us. So that was pre-operative. You now see Sumitra post-operatively. So that one anecdote really encapsulates the humanitarian outreach for Project Prakash. So far, we have screened over 40,000 children for ophthalmic conditions, provided treatment to over 400, surgical treatment to over 400 of them, and non-surgical care to over 1,400 of them. In pursuing this humanitarian mission, we also have a remarkable scientific opportunity. We have a window, potentially, into understanding how vision develops after the onset of sight. And there are many, many questions about visual development that we can ask through the prism of Project Prakash. And this is just a small list of the scientific questions that become available to us to address through Project Prakash. I'm certainly not going to go through all of them. I don't even expect you to read through all of these questions. I'm going to highlight only 2 of them just because they're interesting in their own right, And also, they connect to the kinds of themes that have been raised at this workshop. So the first one is, can the visual cortex change its organization late in life? But before I go into that, let me also point out the other person from Project Prakash who we have with us today, Dr. Amy Kalia. Amy is also a postdoctoral fellow in the lab. Both Amy and Tapan have been key contributors to Project Prakash. So let's look at the first question. Can the visual cortex change its organization later in life? And this ties very closely to the work that I started out with, the notion of brain plasticity and how it's affected by early visual deprivation. So we have directly looked at reorganization of the visual cortex in the primary in the Prakash children using fMRI, a facility in New Delhi. And instead of going into details, I'm just going to give you essentially at a glance kinds of pictures. So what you're seeing here is a time series of the brain of one 20-year-old from 2 days before surgery, a week after surgery, a month after surgery, and 4 months after surgery. And the technical detail here is that this is an independent components analysis of resting state functional connectivity data. But for those of you who are not really into this field, it's not really critical to understand what all that is. All I want you to take away from this picture is how much change is evident even in the cortex of a 20-year-old very rapidly after surgery. So within 4 months, the organization of the primary visual cortex is undergoing a dramatic transformation. And in particular, the primary visual cortex seems to be undergoing a progressive decorrelation with the onset of visual information. So this is one evidence of preserved plasticity even late in life. Here's another example. This is a more conventional kind of analysis. We are looking at the development of spatially organized selectivities for different object classes. And for this particular data set, we are looking at where in the brain, if anywhere, do we find selectivity for faces. So when the child is shown pictures of faces versus pictures of other objects, can we localize regions in the brain that are selectively responsive to faces? So this is a 21-year-old. At 2 days post-surgery, you already begin to see some telltale hotspots in roughly the right region of the brain. And then as time progresses, that activation gets progressively strengthened, and by about 10 months, the activation as assessed by a 1.5T scanner is essentially indistinguishable from the activation that you would observe in the normal brain. So once again, just like the resting state data, these data point to the preserved plasticity even after 2 decades of deprivation. So that's one vignette. The other one has to do with the development of cross-modal mappings. We have heard a lot about tactile sensitivity in the blind, or extracting information from the world using the touch sensors we have. The question that we are asking here is, how do we integrate information across different modalities, specifically between vision and touch? So for most of us, the ability to map what we are seeing to what we are feeling with our hands is automatic. It's very, very straightforward. I can feel this object in my hand in total darkness and subsequently have no trouble at all picking out this object from many others just by sight. So I can connect my vision to my touch. But how does this mapping come about? Is this something that my brain is born with? Is it an innate mapping? Or is it something that I have to learn? This question has been, it's been considered to be an important enough question that it has its own name. It's called the Molyneux question, named after the Irish scientist and philosopher who first posed it in the late 17th century. So Molyneux asked in a letter to John Locke, who was one of the British empiricists, whether a person who has been born blind, so hypothetically, a person who has been born blind and has learned to recognize objects in the world just through touch, if in adulthood, through some miracle, this person were to gain sight, would this person be able to immediately recognize by vision what he or she is able to recognize by touch? So that's the Molyneux question, and for the past over 300 years, this question had remained open. But it's a fundamental question because it's important for our understanding of how these cross-modal mappings develop. Just as an aside, if you look at the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, one of the go-to resources for philosophers, it says about this problem, there is no problem in the history of the philosophy of perception that has provided more thought, that has provoked more thought than the problem that Molyneux raised in 1688. In this sense, Molyneux's problem is one of the most fruitful thought experiments ever proposed in the history of philosophy. So certainly a very significant question in the philosophy of mind. And we finally had a chance to address this question directly. This is Professor Richard Held, who is an esteemed friend and a collaborator on this particular experiment. So Dick, at the age of 87, accompanied us to New Delhi, and we worked with 5 children and finally got to this question. Seth, how much time do I have?
We have about
3 minutes. All right, so let me not then take you through the details of the experiment. Rather, let me cut to the chase of what the result was. The result, I typically take a poll of the audience, and gratifyingly, most of the audience members predict the answer wrong. The answer that we found to Molyneux's question is a negative one. That is, immediately after the onset of sight, the Prakash children are unable to connect their tactile modality to their visual modality. What they recognize by touch, they cannot recognize by vision. But, so even though the answer to the basic Molyneux question is a no, there's an interesting addendum to it. And that is that if you give these children the opportunity to explore their worlds with both vision and touch, even for a period as short as a week, that seems to be enough to initialize the mapping in their brains. So if you, well, these bar graphs won't really make much sense given I haven't described the paradigm, but within a week, their ability to map from touch to vision registers a remarkable increase. So the summary of that work is that there does not appear to be an immediate transfer from touch to vision after sight onset, but the ability to transfer is acquired rapidly. Again, attesting to the plasticity of the brain even late in life. So this question has had an interesting trajectory. It was framed in Ireland. Molyneux wrote a letter to John Locke. John Locke included it in his famous monograph, An Essay on Human Understanding, which then influenced philosophers all across Europe. Then in the 19th century, that question came over to the philosophers in the US. There was quite a bit of thought given to it. And finally, just a few years ago, American scientists went to India and got the answer. So this interesting conclusion that such a distinguished question finally being answered by children in India, that caught our fancy and also caught the fancy of many journalists. So there were many news articles written about this. We reported the results in Nature Neuroscience a couple of years ago. This finding leads to many open questions. One of the most important one is, what kinds of mechanisms might account for such rapid learning? When we say that within a week, such mapping can be established, what kind of learning mechanisms might be at work to make that happen. And this question also applies to many of the other visual tasks we have been exploring as part of Project Prakash, be it face detection or perceiving causality or the integration of visual cues. For each one of them, we can ask, what are the mechanisms, the underlying mechanisms for visual learning? And the theoretical position that we are being led to based on our data is that each one of these different tasks perhaps does not have its own idiosyncratic underlying mechanism, but rather they might share a common foundational building block. And that foundational building block, at least one of those blocks, is the processing, the ability to process dynamic information, time-varying information from the world. And I'm happy to talk about it at greater length offline. This idea has also allowed us to connect Project Prakash to other domains beyond childhood blindness. So in the domain of engineering, it guides us for creating autonomous learning systems. And in neurology, it's allowing us to formulate hypotheses about conditions such as autism quite unexpectedly. So let me summarize then. Project Prakash has been a very gratifying undertaking for my lab. It has given us some insights regarding brain plasticity and learning. It has given us some clinically relevant hypotheses for conditions like autism. It is guiding the design of artificial intelligence systems. It's played an important role in the educational trajectories of the students who have been involved in the project. And most significantly, of course, it has helped alleviate, in some modest measure, the burden of blindness in the developing world, in India in particular. But this is just the beginning. There are far more significant challenges in store for us. So considering how many children we have treated so far, this is what we have accomplished so far. So if you take the problem in India alone, this is what we have tackled, the green dot, and there are so many more children who still need to be treated. And one can think of a similar graphic for the scientific side of the project. We have addressed some scientific questions, but there's a whole universe of other scientific questions that are waiting to be addressed. So it's an overwhelming challenge as we proceed forward. But I'd like to conclude with Albert Einstein's famous words that even though it's a big challenge, those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act. So knowing how big the problem is, knowing how significant the impact of our intervention can be on the lives of the children and also on science, I think we are morally obligated to do something about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Why don't we try to take a question or two while Lotfi comes up and sets up? Questions for Pavan?
So earlier somebody was mentioning cochlear implants and how long it takes to have coherent perception of the sound. And so it seems like people, or these children, are very quickly able to learn this mapping between how they feel, right, how the object feels, to what it looks like. It said it only takes about a week to learn some of these. And then, I don't know, but maybe somebody does, how long it takes to learn like a mapping from maybe someone who is born deaf and has a cochlear implant to learn a mapping from the sound that they hear to maybe like written language that they already know. I'd imagine it takes much longer, and I wonder if the reason that they can do this so fast is really what they're doing is learning maybe a perspective projection. You know, so it's a simple mapping. It's not maybe as complicated as language to audio or something. I don't know if you have thoughts
it's quite
about
possible.
this.
I would love to know a little more about what that, how long that mapping takes after cochlear implants. But even if there are differences, there could be very many explanations for those differences. The information that one's getting through vision might be richer than the information that one gets after a cochlear implant. Because here, instead of implanting a prosthetic eye, we are simply enabling the natural eye to begin to perceive the world. And that might be richer information than what say, an 8-channel cochlear implant might be giving to the brain.
Thank you.
Yes.
how the question was framed.
The Molyneux question?
Yeah.
Yes. So
no, I mean to the kids.
Yes. So the experimental paradigm, if I may take a minute, Seth. So what we did was, in the crucial transfer condition, we would have the child feel an object, and this would be like a children's building block that they're not familiar with. They would feel this object under a sheet, which is obscuring their vision, so they're simply feeling the object. We take that object away, again under the sheet. We then place that object and another object in front of them, and they are asked to pick out the object that they were just feeling. So it's a match to sample task.
Okay.
So just tell us which of these two objects was the object you were just holding in your hand.
And they had no time to sort of understand what it is that they had felt.
Right, because these were meaningless objects. These are just children's blocks. So we are not asking them to name what the object is. We are just asking them to say, tell us what shape.
But would they know how to name it?
They would not, because it's like a curved object with a protruding thing. So we are not expecting them to name the object.
I see.
These are non-nameable objects.
And would they be able to draw the object?
I would doubt that, because the visual-motor capabilities, even though we haven't systematically studied these, it would take some time for the visual-motor capabilities to develop. So we did not ask them to draw these objects.
Or to sort of,
Describe.
shape it in space. Like, what was the shape? What was the shape?
Yeah, so we haven't asked for any subjective descriptions. Rather, we tried to keep the paradigm to be as straightforward, as objective as possible. Just point to which of the two objects you were holding.
And I think we have to stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you again. Our next speaker is Lotfi MERABET. Lotfi from Harvard, who's going to tell us about educational games.
Thank you, Seth. First of all, good afternoon. My thanks to the Foundation for the invitation, and also to Seth for the invitation, and also for scheduling me after Pavan. So now that the bar is very, very high, I'll try to do my best in my presentation also. I want to just reiterate a couple of points that were brought up this morning about what are some of the challenges that blind people face. And if you ask them systematically, there tends to be two things that they say. The first is the ability to access text, whether that be in a book or a sign on the wall. And the second issue is finding their way, navigating through particularly a place that's unfamiliar, or particularly in a situation where a route that's normally familiar is no longer available. And it's not hard to conceptualize this. If I give you a blindfold, for example, and I ask you to walk back home with a blindfold, I'm sure you'll find it quite challenging. And on top of that, imagine also that the route that you normally take is no longer available. Can you problem solve? Can you try to get around that situation? Now, fortunately, there is formal training for people living with profound blindness and visual impairment for this purpose, and it's called orientation or O&M mobility training, O&M training or orientation mobility training. And the idea here is to learn various tools such as a white cane or a guide dog or various assistive devices to learn how to live, to learn navigation, independence navigation, I should say, in the real world. There's also some very, very nice technology. We've heard some fantastic presentations this morning. This is just another piece of technology I happen to like from the Sendero group in California. And it's a GPS-based system where an individual can walk around, and using a GPS signal, they can access various information about the name of a street or how far they are from a various landmark or some of the landmarks that's around them. Now, of course, all technologies have strengths and weaknesses, and the big weakness with this particular case is that it only works outdoors, right? The satellite has to see you in order for the signal to actually work. But the second is a more important philosophical one that we haven't raised yet actually today, and that is what happens when the technology fails? When the technology fails, does the person fail? And are we doing anything for that part in terms of helping that individual? Now, I want to be clear, I'm a big fan of assistive technology, but there's something to be said for assistive technology to do a task, and there's also something to be said about assistive technology to learn and to train. And that was also a philosophy in our project that I'm presenting for you today. So in a nutshell, here is the rationale. This is how we kind of put it together. So it's about virtual reality, learning by simulation, and video games. So the best example I can give you is a flight simulator. If you are a pilot, or if you want to learn how to learn a plane, or how to land in a difficult airport, or how to fly through a difficult setting, you can use a flight simulator to go through the motions, to train through the various procedures, and get your mind, if you will, cognitively correct in terms of how are the proper sequences that must be used to carry out that task. And this has been quantified, what's called the transfer of effectiveness ratio, which is about 50%, which means for every 2 hours you spend in a flight simulator, it's the equivalent of 1 hour of actual real flight time. And this has revolutionized the aviation industry, as you might imagine. So people have taken this strategy and thought about, can we do this in other scenarios as well, particularly for children with cognitive and developmental disabilities or issues. Another nice project, this is Elizabeth Strickland. You see a child here wearing a head display, a virtual reality helmet, and as the child walks around, they have a virtual reality environment around them that's an intersection. And what the child does, using various friends and animations and so on, they learn how to cross the street safely by reinforcing positive behaviors and by suppressing negative behaviors. And in a safe, controlled environment, the child can go through the motions, learn the various cognitive procedures that are needed, and then that way, when they actually go to the real world, they have those procedures in their mind and they're ready to do the task. The last piece I want to save or share with you is this idea of video games and just how pervasive they are in society. If you have a teenager or if you play video games yourself, you know what I mean. This is a great book called Reality is Broken by Jane McGonigal, and one of my favorite quotes says, by the age of 21, the average gamer will have spent over 10,000 hours playing video games, which is the equivalent of time spent from the 5th grade to high school graduation if you have perfect attendance. That is an enormous amount of time that individuals are spending playing, quote, games. I see this as an opportunity, as a parallel education. And the question is can we somehow leverage this in our favor? So, this is how the project came about. If you grew up in the 80s like I did, there was a very popular video game called Doom. I'll play a very quick video for you if you're not familiar with this. I guarantee you, I certainly played 10,000 hours of this game, so I'm certainly contributing to that book in terms of the data. So this is what's called a first-person shooter game. The idea is you have to walk around this labyrinth, and you have to kill these bad guys, you got to find munitions and treasures and so on, and you navigate through this labyrinth to find your way through to the next level, a portal level. Now, key to success in this game is you have to build a cognitive spatial map in your mind. You have to keep track of what that world is, that virtual world in your mind. So, Professor Jamie Sanchez, a collaborator of mine at the University of Chile, has developed Audio Doom, which is exactly the same game, but for blind children. And what's interesting about this is using only audio-based cues, blind children play exactly the same game. They navigate through labyrinths and so on. Interestingly, if you talk to the teachers who know these kids, they'll tell you that these kids who play the games do better in school. They're much more socially interactive. They do better in abstract parts of science and math and geometry as well. And that's largely anecdotal. But there's a much more objective question that I think we can ask is, what is the nature of those mental maps in an individual who's never seen before? And we can actually answer this question objectively. And it looks a little something like this. If you ask a child to navigate a level, a series of corridors, a labyrinth and what have you, and then you ask the child to take Lego pieces and construct a map of the world that they went through, the child can build a perfect one-to-one representation of that labyrinth that they walked through, even though they've never seen and don't have prior visual experience in theory, and they've never seen the world themselves. So what that tells you is that A, you can build this map in your mind, and you can do it with just non-visual cues as well. So here's the project. If this is possible, if they enjoy playing the game and you have this accurate map in your mind, why not play the game in a place that actually exists? And that's what we did. So we took the floor plans of an existing building here in Boston. I'll explain to you where that is in a second. Render that in a virtual game setting, have the individual play the game, and then we physically take them to that building and ask them, now that you have this map in your mind, can you find your way through the building? In this picture, just to know, this is Joe Quintanilla, who's in the third row. He was one of the very first pilot subjects for the study. So this is the Carroll Center for the Blind in Newton, Massachusetts. I've had the pleasure of having a great working collaborative relationship with this institution for about 10 years now. This is an aerial view of the campus. You see the various buildings. And what we did is we chose one particular building called the St. Paul building, and I'll explain why in just a second. Took the floor plans of that building, rendered it in this virtual game setting. We have individuals, as I mentioned, play the game, and then we physically take them to the St. Paul building and say, now that you have this map in your mind, can you find your way through the building? We chose this building for two reasons. One is because it's quite complex. It's 2 stories. It has about 22 rooms, various exits, various corridors, and so on. So it's a controlled real-world setting, if you will. And the second aspect is that this is an administrative building. This is a building that no one normally has access to. So we wanted to use a place that they were completely unfamiliar with before they enrolled in the study. As I mentioned, playing the game, they build a map in their mind, and then we assess their performance when we take them there. So the software that we use is called ABIS, or Audio-Based Environment Simulator, and this is the premise of how the game works, or how the interface works. First, we use what's called earcons. In the same way that you have icons, well, earcons are iconic sounds, if you will, that represent something. Secondly, these sounds are spatialized. So to give you an example, if you hear a knocking sound, that is the sound that indicates the presence of a door. If you hear that knocking sound in your right ear, that means that the door is on your right side. Now notice, if you walk through this environment and then turn around and come back, you should now hear the knocking sound in your left ear. And that's what the software is doing. It's following or tracking your egocentric heading. As you walk through the environment, you are engaging with these sounds, and by presenting them in various orders in various places, it allows you to generate this mental map in your mind through sound alone. Again, just showing you here the overall layout, very, very simple cues, left and right, moving forward. I'll show you a quick video here that I'll need the audio for, showing a blind individual playing with this game. So hopefully you can hear that. What you see the individual here, they're walking around. And again, remember, they don't see this. This is only for you to have a sense of where they're walking. They're hearing the sounds of a jewel that's hidden inside their building. Your task is to navigate inside this building, search for these jewels that are hidden. Once you find a jewel, you have to take it outside, come back into the building and find another one. And you notice in red there are these roving monsters. And if they catch you when you have a jewel, they take the jewel and they hide it somewhere else. So we've created, if you will, a metaphor that forces you to navigate as much as possible and explore the building as much as possible. Here you see the person walking outside. They'll come back. I'll show you just another quick segment here.
First floor, stairwell 1, west.
Here they're going to walk up the stairs. You see how the pitch increases as they walk up. Here they are on the second floor, and they go through, and again, they play for hours and hours and hours on this, based on this metaphor. So, the other thing that we're very interested in is how do you learn the map in terms of the mode of learning. So ABIS can be engaged or interacted with in 2 different ways. The first is what's called directed navigation mode. And what we did is we took an orientation mobility instructor, an O&M instructor, to the St. Paul building with a blind client and filmed them going through a class of how they would teach them the layout of the building. And then we create a virtual rendition of that course or of that lesson. And we use that as a structured method to virtually teach them the spatial layout of the building. The other option is what I just mentioned, is what's called game mode, where we say nothing to the individual. We say, this is simply a game. Your job is to walk through this virtual environment. This is how you play it. You have to find these jewels, take them outside, and be careful of these monsters. And notice at no time do we ever tell the individuals that they have to retain the map in their mind. We just simply say, this is a game, and this is how you play it. And now we're going to compare them head to head to see how these 2 modalities compare in terms of generating the map in their mind. So just to show you some pilot data at the very, very beginning to give you a sense of what these results look like. On the left, you see an individual who interacted with the ABIS software, and we asked them to navigate in the physical building from the lobby on the 1st floor up the stairwell to bedroom 6, which just happens to be the longest path in the building. And you notice whether you do it through directed navigation or you do it through gaming, you can actually carry out this task. So you have the map in your mind, and you can transfer it for the purposes of this task. Notice further is that the timing is about the same as well. But the interesting question is this. Once you're at that spot, we ask you to exit the building as quickly as possible. And what we notice is those who interact or learn the map through gaming find the shortest routes, whereas those individuals who learn by directed navigation retrace their paths, as if they were constrained to the learning information that they were given, whereas in gaming, they can come up with other solutions, shortcuts, and problem solving. So we thought this was intriguing. Now, how do we quantify this? Very, very simply, we put you in various parts in the building. We call this a drop-off task. And if you find the simplest or the shortest route out, we give you 3 points. If you find the second shortest, it's 2. If you find the longest path out, it's 1. And if you can't find your way out, that's 0. And that's a very, very simple way to quantify what route did you take. And this is what the overall data looks like. We have over 30 participants, early blind and late blind, aged between 14 and 45, who went through this. And I'm going to separate the data for you here on the physical navigation task. So they go from A to B, C to D, and so on, in early blind individuals, in late blind individuals, and separating also between gaming and directed navigation. So on the left, on the physical navigation task, what you find is that early blind individuals do very, very well on this. It's about a transfer rate on the order of 85 to 95% correct in terms of the map they have in their mind and carrying out a series of navigation tasks. The other interesting thing is that late blind individuals do about the same. So there doesn't seem to be an advantage of prior visual experience on this task. So you transfer at a very, very high rate, and there doesn't seem to be a difference between early or late blind, or whether you learn by directed navigation or through gaming. The drop-off task that I mentioned, this is the one where you have to integrate the map in your mind and find shortcuts. This is where we see the advantage. Gamers, on average, will find the shortest route, whereas those individuals who were in the directed navigation are constrained to the information that they already learned through the sequential learning, and this is true in early blind and in late blind individuals as well. So just to summarize this, it appears that you can interact with this software using non-visual information, generate this mental map in your mind, and at the same time transfer it for the purposes of a real physical navigation task. What we think is happening is that in the case of directed navigators, they are essentially constrained. There's a form of didactic learning, if you will, whereas the gamers have a much more robust mental map in their mind because they have multiple perspectives of how the spatial interrelations of the rooms are, and they can find these shortcuts. Now, as a neuroscience lab, we're also very intrigued, how does the brain do this? So in our first step, we've modified ABBIS to be used in an fMRI scanner. So now we have the opportunity of looking at blind individuals in the scanner while they carry out these virtual navigation tasks and see what parts of the brain are active. On your left, I'm showing you a sighted blindfolded individual who trained on this ABBIS task. And what you see here is a series of activation areas. You see activation in motor tactile areas as they actuate the keys, frontal areas for planning, auditory areas as they're listening to the cues. The parahippocampus is the part of the brain responsible for memory and navigation as well. And perhaps not surprisingly, activation in the visual cortex also. If you ask an early blind individual to do exactly the same thing, you notice that overall, spatially, the map is actually quite similar. The same parts of the brain seem to be active, including visual cortex, which is an interesting question. What is the role of the visual cortex in this task if you don't have any prior visual experience? So I have to tell you that this was not a uniform finding. In fact, when we looked at our early blind individuals, we saw very, very varied activation. Some had very, very robust activation everywhere. Some had activation that was very focal. Some individuals activated one area but not another. So we wanted to get a handle on what that variability was. And is that activation somehow related to something besides the actual navigation task? So we decided to think that, is that activation related to how good a navigator you are in reality, in the real world? And we used the Santa Barbara Sense of Direction Scale. It's adapted for blind individuals. It's a series of questionnaires, various instruments here, that ask questions like, I rely heavily on sighted people to arrive at a destination. I have trouble understanding directions. You score this on a 5-point or 7-point Likert scale, and the higher your score, the more spatially independent an individual you are. These are the 9 early blind individuals who were in the task, and the interesting thing you notice here is that if you look at their primary mobility aid and you rank them from highest to lowest, you'll find that all the highest scores were using long canes. These are expert navigators who use the subway system and so on, whereas the individuals who had the lowest scores were individuals who didn't use public transportation, often used have an individual to drive them places, and in the middle were individuals with guide dogs. So the profile seems to fit with how we rank using this system. And if you run that correlation against all the brain activity in every single individual, you find this locus of activation in the right hemisphere called the right temporal parietal junction, which we know is the part of the brain responsible for situational awareness in space. So it seems to be almost like a biomarker, if you will. This is the part of the brain that seems to be correlated with how well you are in terms of carrying out this navigation task. The more activation you have here, the less likely you are, or the better you are in terms of a navigator. So, that being said, just to conclude, I want to show you very, very quickly, we're doing also now indoor and outdoor environments as well. You can imagine mapping out the entire campus for this purpose as well. We're also recently, that's just the interface there. We're also recently forming a collaboration with the MBTA, the Massachusetts Bay Transit Authority. This is Park Street Station, and using exactly their floor maps, we can do exactly the same thing and render it in our software as well. Use this as a way to learn offline, access the information online as well, and at the same time track individuals. And then the last thing I want to share with you is there are possibilities beyond just navigation. This is a DAC. This is a way, do you remember the movie Fantastic Voyage, where you shrink individuals, they can travel through the body, using the same strategy strategy to learn anatomy, various parts of the body as well, and you can see that they're mainstreamed with sighted individuals here accessing the same information. And finally, two last thoughts. One of my favorite quotes from Plato, it says, you can discover more about a person in an hour of play than in a year of conversation. And he knew this well before video games. I think that's very, very true. And the last is a photo that I have hanging in the lab from the National Sports Center for the Disabled. You see a sighted guide dog looking up this mountain, presumably at his master who's climbing the mountain. I show this for two reasons. One, because I think it has an excellent sense of optimism, because I think that's indeed what we should be heading for. And second, to remind us that all the technology we're developing, whether it be a retinal prosthesis, sensory substitution, or what have you, it has to be better than what already exists. And we tend to forget that. It's not about just inventing the device. It's about improving the quality of life of individuals today. And we have to measure and we have to demonstrate that. So that's why I want to share that thought with you. And then my final thoughts and acknowledgments to my collaborators, Jamie Sanchez from Chile, Aaron Connors, who did the behavioral work, Mark Helko, the postdoctoral fellow, the Carroll Center for the Blind, I'm very, very gracious for, and also all of you. Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you, Lockley. Great. Okay, Lapo, could you please come up and get started, and maybe we can take a question or two? Please, David, use the mic, please.
So I had a question about, you said that they were playing the game for hours and hours, and I was just wondering, did you, have you done any looking into how many hours of in-game training it takes to acquire the same amount of, or some, what's the transfer ratio for the time it would take them to do the learning in Orientation Mobility 1? And then 2, have you investigated any results on how long it takes them, how long they can retain these models in a game versus own them?
Yes. So is this on? I hope. Yeah, it's on. Thank you. So excellent questions. I apologize if that wasn't clear. I didn't mean to say that these individuals are playing for hours and hours. I just wanted to say that the individuals, when we pilot tested this, really enjoyed playing the game. We ran a clinical trial where individuals had no more than 90 minutes, whether you were in the gaming arm or the directed navigation arm. You had either 2 45-minute sessions or 3 30-minute sessions. So everybody had the same exposure time. So I want to be very, very clear about that. The second thing that I didn't mention is that there's a third arm that I didn't bring in in the interest of time. There is a control arm where individuals played the game in an environment that had nothing to do with the St. Paul building. And then when you take those individuals and you bring them to the building, they can't find their way, as you might imagine. So that tells you that it's not just playing a game that does this, it's the context that's extremely important. And that was the point of that control arm. Your last question about longitudinally, how do we see this progressing? We haven't done that study yet, and we're quite curious about that. Can you do a long-term longitudinal study to see, A, do they retain, and B, do they do better on other non-related tasks? So in other words, there's a near transfer component, but is there also a far transfer component in terms of anecdotally what was reported about them getting better in school and social interactions and so on? But that has to be done on a much longer scale with pre and post assessments.
Do you have time? Great. Fantastic talk.
Thank you.
Have you compared with trying to learn the map using a tactile map? It's not as cool as a video game. However, if we have one very nice large form factor, refreshable, bright, like that's what we heard about this morning,
yes,
you can make it into a game.
Yes, absolutely. So that is exactly what we want to do now. To be very honest with you, I mean, this was quite exploratory. We had no idea what the transference would be. We wanted to just work in that single modality. Now the idea is to go head-to-head with a tactile representation. The Carroll Center for the Blind has a very accurate tactile map that we can use, and now subjects will be randomized to game versus tactile map. So, sorry, I've been cut off, but we'll talk more.
Thank you very much. All right, lapo.governi is next from Firenze. Tell us about tactile models.
Thank you very much, Professor Teller, and I want to thank the ABF and the MIT for inviting me here today and give me the opportunity of presenting the work that me and my colleagues from Florence, Italy, are carrying out, dealing with 3D tactile models for blind people. We live in a city which is very rich in terms of art, which is Florence, and we are surrounded by famous paintings and piece of visual art, and so this work was born from the consideration that visually impaired people and blind people are to a great extent prevented from accessing this kind of works of visual art. And so we also consider that only a limited number of museums, such as the one you see in the slide, the Tactile Museum, Omero in Ancona, which is a very quite well-known one, the Tactile Museum of the Blind in Athens, the Technological Museum in Zagreb in Croatia, and then Victoria and Albert Museum. Very few museums host permanent exhibition devoted to blind people. And even more important is that these exhibitions always present reproductions of actually 3D objects, like architectural models on scale, for instance, sculptures, and so on. Almost none of them present reproductions of paintings. One of the exceptions is in Italy, it is the Museo Anteros in Bologna, where there are a number of reproductions of famous paintings for tactile explorations. And there have been several studies carried out there in order to demonstrate that blind people appreciate very much this kind of exploration and this kind of reproduction. However, the reason why, in my opinion, so few exhibitions exist devoted to this kind of reproduction is that though a number of guidelines have been produced, even by the American Foundation of the Blind, for instance, and of the Spoken Book Association in Italy, and so on, they are not encoded. Some rules are not yet completely encoded in order to translate a graphic art in a tactile representation, mostly when we speak of visual artwork. Moreover, some kind of reproductions, such as the ones from Museo Anteros, require a skilled artist in order to be produced, and a huge amount of work. So our goal, indeed, would be to try to make it a little bit more automatic, even with the trade-off of a lower quality, to build a tactile representation of a painting so that everybody could use, let's say, a software tool to make such kind of representation. In addition, we know that 3D printing technology is becoming more affordable every day, and so in the near future, maybe every family could have at his house a 3D printer, and so realize at home a 3D representation to be explored, tactilely explored by a blind person. However, first we need to decide to be sure to what kind of representation we want to go, towards what kind of representation we would like to obtain. And to this purpose, we examine the conventional kinds of tactile representation we can find when thinking of works of art, which are basically the tactile outline, which is also called relief outline, the texturized relief, which is very much appreciated by the American Foundation for the Blind, the flat-layered bas relief, and the bas relief intended like defined in the Renaissance, for instance. So we asked a panel of 24 volunteers to help us, and to the Italian Union of the Blind to help us in defining and exploring what the best strategy was when dealing with artworks. And so we selected two quite famous paintings, one from an Italian painter, Giorgio Morandi, which is a 20th century painter, and another one from Fernando Botero, which is a contemporary Colombian painter, which are quite simple. We chose them simple just because we wanted them to be easy to understand, and translated them in all the four kinds of representation I mentioned before by using a very interactive computer-based procedure. We didn't mean here to build anything systematic, just to have the prototypes done in order to test them. So the tactile outline, here we have the texturized patterns. We obtain it by means of superimposition on 3D texture on the tactile outlines version. Here we have the flat layer bas relief version obtained by an interactive procedure working directly on depth map. And finally, we have the bas relief, which has been obtained directly from a CAD representation. We 3D model the objects roughly 3D model the objects in a CAD system and then realize the bas relief. So these objects were 3D printed using PolyJet technology, and these were submitted to our end users,
we asked them to explore. And this end user were completely blind. 15 of them had congenitally blind and 9 late blind. We proposed them 3 kinds of exploration, and an autonomous one, a partly guided, and a totally guided one. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go into the details of the results we obtained, but however, I would like to point out, in particular, two things that, in my opinion, are quite important. First of all is that among all the different kind of prototypes, the bas relief one is considered to be the most meaningful and pleasant to explore, whatever it may mean. This is not so obvious as it may seem, because many of the people we interviewed were familiar with other kind of representation, like relief outline, which can be obtained, for instance, via the Minolta method. And actually, many of the end users recognize that tactile outline provided clearer contours and which were easier to follow. Nonetheless, they globally prefer the bas relief representation. The second observation is that in bas relief representation, the different relief given to different objects with respect to their position, with respect to their position with respect to the observer, greatly helps the blind user to discriminate objects which are closer or far away, so on the foreground or in the background of the representation. And this is also coherent with studies performed at Museo Anteros by Loretta Secchi and other researchers. Okay, so once we were assured about the kind of representation we wanted to pursue, we tried to figure out a workflow of a possible computer-based methodology in order to at least partly automate the translation process. And we consider, at least for the moment, the situation of central point perspective paintings, which are typical of the Renaissance period in Florence. Actually, we would like to Tuscany and Tuscan City to be our first testing ground, and we are full of Renaissance paintings, and so we're addressing to this kind of paintings, at least for the moment. And the procedure we thought was structured according to 3 steps. In the first step, we thought of a reconstruction of a schematic representation of the scene, which is similar to the flat layered one I've shown you before, by using only planes and primitives. And for the moment, we only use cylinders besides plane. We didn't consider cones or spheres. And the second step consists of generating more specific volumes for the most important object in the scene, for instance, particular architectural elements or human figures. And the third step consists of combining the previous 2. Okay. In order to explain the methodology, let me show the case study we used to develop it, which is the Beato Angelico's Annunciation, which can be found in the San Marco Museum in Florence. It's one of the best-known masterpieces of Italian Renaissance. And it is found at the 2nd floor of the museum, which is quite a large fresco, and is placed just next to the friar cells, because the museum was formerly a cloister, actually. And what we did is actually to start from a segmented image. This is a key issue, because we tested several automatic segmentation techniques to segment this image, but we did not find a technique yet which was sufficiently accurate. So I'm here with so many colleagues and professionals. I would like also to ask for your help from this point of view. And however, we developed a prototypal software using MATLAB. And so the first step, as I was saying before, is based on perspective information. Of course, there are a number of works and studies, and these are in commercial software like, for instance, Autodesk Image Modeler, dealing with this kind of reconstruction. However, we tried a more simple and intuitive approach, even if probably less rigorous, in order to make the system usable even for a non-technical user. And
The procedure uses grade gradients and which are assigned to different objects and is based on the definition on a main plane which is to be selected by the user. Okay, we developed a very simple and intuitive user interface where the user is asked to classify a link between each other, the different region. For instance, here in the picture that you see, the archangel body has to be selected and classified as a frontal plane attached to the base one, and the column shot, for instance, is to be classified as vertical cylinder. And at this point, a number of considerations can help make some of the choices automatic, but there's no time for me to explain it in detail. Okay, this is what we obtain in the end, an height map representing a flat, not so flat because actually columns are cylindric, okay, but almost flat representation of the scene. And so we can begin with the second step, which is the volume generation, and needs to be performed only for objects which have not been represented in the first step in a sufficient way. This volume generation uses three quite simple tools which have been actually tailored for this specific application. We use three surfaces composing the final volume, which is, the first one is an inflated surface obtained starting from the object's outlines. The second one is obtained by using an interactive shape from shading approach. And the third one is a fine detailed surface provided either directly by the image or by its gradient. What we obtain here are the three surfaces which need to be combined in the final one. And here we developed, there are a few images of the user interface, which is useful to select the appropriate weights of the three components defined before, and to obtain a satisfactory surface. It's also useful to assess the amount of relief to be given to a certain object with respect to the others. Okay, here I have a brief demonstration video. Sorry, this is not gonna work. Only a second. Okay, this video refers only to the left half of the painting because we didn't have enough graphic power to read the whole painting at the time, because we are using MATLAB, which we all know it's not optimized for graphic display. And moreover, the left part is the one which is better reconstructed using our procedure, so I chose this one to show you. Here, in fact, you see, for instance, frontal figures to be selected, attached to the main plane, so that their position is automatically determined. So we have the angel body and the back wall. Another situation is where you cannot see where a frontal plane is attached to something, so you have to select directly a gray level where to generate the depth from. And this happens from the angel wing and also from the capital of the column. And another situation is the generation of cylinder, where you simply need to click on the cylinder and define a number of points for generating the appropriate gray level. Since I have not much time, I'm gonna go directly to the final result we obtained with this procedure, after actually a little polygon editing, which is not so little as we would like, but however, quite little. And these are first reduced scale models we actually printed in order to evaluate the optimal coating and surface finishing for the final reproduction, which will be exposed and presented at the Museo di San Marco in Firenze in January next year. So I invite you all to come and see it and touch it. We are also working on on other subjects, like in this case, we have the healing of the cripple and the raising of Tabitha Brancacci Chapel. We are obtaining quite good results with this. And in the end, I want just to acknowledge the researchers who participated to this activity, and most important, Tuscany region, who co-founded the project, and especially the group of volunteers from the Italian Union of the Blind who helped us with this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Lapo. Let's take one quick question while the next speaker sets up. Professor LADNER, please come up. Question.
Oh, you have your own?
Yeah.
I can go right here.
Thank you, Lapo.
Do you have any audio?
No.
Okay. Okay.
All right. Professor LADNER from UW will tell us about empowering blind scientists and engineers.
Thank you for inviting me. Those of you who know me know that I actually wear two hats. One hat is an accessibility researcher, formerly a theoretical computer scientist. And another hat I wear is a huge promoter of getting more people with disabilities into science, engineering, and mathematics. And when I got invited to this conference, I was trying to think, well, what should I talk about? Should I talk about my research? Well, there's so many great researchers here. You know, I think mine is good, but you know, there's a lot of other stuff that's really good. Maybe I'll talk about the second topic, which is getting more, well, in this case, people who are blind into science, engineering, and mathematics. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm first going to introduce you to a few people who are blind and are significant scientists or engineers. There's Kent Cullors. He has a PhD in physics. He ran the SETI project for a number of years. There's Carrie Sapalo, who has a PhD in chemistry. He's a professor at Illinois State University. He's actually a fairly new professor. Gerard Vermeij is a distinguished professor at the University of California, Davis, in evolutionary biology. There's Imke Dure. She works at NOAA. She has a PhD in atmospheric science. David Wohlers is another PhD in chemistry. He's a professor at Truman State University in Missouri. There's T.V. Raman, who's a very famous computer scientist who works at Google. This could go on a long time, actually. So there's three more. Cheiko Asakawa, she's a PhD in computer science, and she's a lead scientist at IBM. I think she has a very high title now, IBM Tokyo Research Lab. There's a new person I met last year, Nicholas Gaitis. He's a PhD in psychology, and he would really have appreciated coming to this conference. A lot of good stuff that he would be interested in. From University of Maine, he's a professor there. Joss Mealy, who's a PhD researcher from Smith Kettlewell. I know Smith Kettlewell is represented here, and it's great that you have him on the staff. So these are a few people that, that I happen to know who, you know, they have PhDs, they're blind, so it's possible. Of course, right now, when I listened to the talk from the gentleman from India, it really got me concerned. You know, that only 1% of blind people in India are employed. That's a very, very low number. And I'm not saying there's thousands of blind PhDs, but there are a goodly number. So the perspective I'm going to take is, as an accessibility researcher, is how can I get more people into my field who are blind? And I'm going to look at some of the principles in human-computer interaction that are out there that sort of speak to this and what they mean. So the first one I'm going to talk about is universal design. I'll talk about ability-based design, which is very similar. I'll talk about user-centered design. And actually, there's been a lot of discussion of that today. And people are employing user-centered design in a lot of the projects I heard about today. Participatory design, to some extent, true here. Design for user empowerment, maybe a little bit here. So universal design, the concept there is you design a product or a service that is good for most people, or as many people as possible. And a couple of examples is, you know, the Swiss Army knife, which is, it has many uses. You just have to configure it to do the thing you want. You want it to be a screwdriver, you want it to be a knife, you want it to be a fingernail clipper, whatever it is. Another one that I really enjoy myself is this adjustable table for just your keyboard. And no matter what height you are at, you can move it away from you easily toward the desk or under the desk, move it toward you, lift it up a little bit, tilt it slightly. All these things you probably should do anyway. Even if you're just one person, you should adjust the height to avoid RSI and repetitive stress injury. So this is kind of a beautiful, universally designed product. Ability-based design is kind of a thing that was invented by Jake Wolbrock and some other people to kind of explain this, to my view, universal design. So you think about a user on the left and a system on the right. Maybe they don't match. It's a blind person and it's a computer screen. They don't really match. So you build something that can go in between the two. That's some adaptation. In this case, it perhaps is a screen reader. So now that a blind person can read the screen because it'll be voiced. Okay, so that's sort of traditional assistive technology. So another model would be that you have a bunch of different kinds of users, some blind, some deaf, some with mobility issues or whatever. Then you build your system from the first place to be sort of adaptable, that you just have to configure your system. So a really good example of that is the iPhone. So the iPhone, you can put it in the sort of standard mode and you can see the screen, you can touch the screen. When you touch the screen lightly, it activates an application. But if you're blind, you just go to the settings and change it slightly, and suddenly this iPhone talks. And when you touch the screen, it doesn't automatically activate. You can explore the screen, and only when you double tap or do some other gesture does something get activated. So it's really nicely designed in this ability-based design or universal design. So let's talk about user-centered design. So this is a popular paradigm for HCI, for building products, and also for HCI research, human-computer interaction research. So the idea is you have an idea for something. So many great ideas today about different things, and they're actually being built, like that tactile display. So you have some knowledge, you design it, you prototype it, then you test it with users, so you involve the users, you get feedback from the users. I gotta change it a little bit, do a redesign, and do this cycle a number of times. And if it's going to be research, when you do the user feedback, you probably want to do a user study. Maybe the first thing you do is a sort of a preliminary study, a formative study, and then finally you do a real user study at the end, and then you can publish something. So this is your traditional way to design things and to do HCI, human-computer interaction research. So participatory design is a little bit different. So we still have the same cycle: analysis, design, prototype, user feedback, and so on. But now we get the users involved in the design. At the very beginning, we try to involve the user in the design of the product in the first place, or the design of the procedure. So they're not just subjects or participants in a study at the very end or in a formative study. They're part of the whole process. Now, what is user empowerment? Design by user empowerment. So here in this cycle, it's the same cycle as before, but it's analysis by users, design by users, prototype by users, and user feedback. Now, of course, they might not be the same users, because the user that's doing the analysis, say it's a researcher, the analysis or the design or the prototyping might be one blind researcher, but the users for user feedback or studies would be other blind people. They would be the subjects. But notice the blind person has been removed from just being a subject or a participant in a study to being a researcher in the study. So this is what I mean by user empowerment. So I think there's 3 determinants for user empowerment. One is a self-determination, a second is community action, and a third is education. I'll talk about all 3. So I'm going to start with talking about, this is my one slide that has my research. I have a project called Mobile Accessibility, and it's very closely related to some of the things that are being done at MIT, Smith, Kettlewell, and some of the other talks we've heard. So we have a blind person. That person has access to a smartphone. That smartphone might have a wireless link to a Braille device, so you can get output in Braille or input in Braille. This smartphone, it can have speech output, so you can listen if you're blind. It could have vibration in as an output. And it can do the usual things. You can use it as a phone, use it to send messages, you can get web services, you can go to Google Maps. From Google Maps, you have GPS, you can find out where you are, you can have a camera, you can take pictures and send them to VizWiz, things like that. And I have a number of projects in this area. I have students doing Braille-based touchscreen input or numeric input, doing a carpenter's level, a talking carpenter's level, using a smartphone, using an accelerometer, 5 minutes. And I just want to mention I have 2 students on this project, Shiri Azenkat, who's about to graduate with her PhD. By the way, she's applied to MIT. And Cynthia Bennett, they're both, well, Shiri is low vision and Cynthia is fully blind. And I'm going to mention a few other people. Bappen, he's deafblind. This is his banner from his webpage. I just want to mention he's recently started a company. So he's deafblind and he's training other deafblind to use the kind of technology I've just shown you. There's Kerry Sapalo, I mentioned earlier. He's a chemist and professor now. He's also started a company called Independent Science. And Independent Science is building technology for blind chemists and other kinds of scientists. And he's a consultant in that area. So he's enabling other blind people to become chemistry professors or chemists. I love this guy, Jerry Leary. He's a coffee roaster. He has a company in Colorado called The Unseen Bean. I highly recommend it. You can order it online. Write it down right now. It's expensive, but it's a lot better than Starbucks, I guarantee you. Now, when he went back, this is partly education, when he wanted to become a coffee roaster, he had to go to school. The school wouldn't take him in because he was blind. He said, you have to be able to see those beans to see that they're roasted the right amount. Well, he proved them wrong. You can smell them and feel them with your fingers and find out when it's done. And the proof is his coffee is better than Starbucks. Community action, I'm just going to mention a few here. The National Federation of the Blind, Natalie Shaheen is their education director, and she's done a lot with youth. National Federation of the Blind takes education seriously, and they have a lot of education programs for youth. There's RS Games, and maybe the games people should look at this RS Games. It's invented by blind people to play games online, and this guy, Michael Forzano, is a new employee at Amazon. I met him the other day. He has a computer science degree. And then there's program L, which is a listserv for blind programmers. So they're working with each other to try and improve the profession. So here's the sort of motto I have. Empower people to solve their own accessibility problems. So bring them into the fold as full-time researchers or developers. And that follows the Lao Tzu, father of Taoism, motto, give a man a fish, you have fed him for today, teach a man to fish, and you have fed him for a lifetime. So now we get to education. And this will be my last bit, I think. I want to talk a little bit about Nicole Torcolini. And Lindsay Yazzolino is out there in the audience and knows Nicole. And anyway, she's, I first met her when she was in high school. She's from the Seattle area. She's totally blind. She has maybe a little light vision. She's also hard of hearing. She wears hearing aids. She had cancer when she was young, and that was the result of the cancer. But she's alive, she's doing well. Anyway, it turned out she was really smart, and she was a computer programmer, and she took AP Computer Science when she was a sophomore and a junior in high school. But she was having problems in her math class. In her math class, she could do the math problems, but in the Nemeth code, which is a Braille code for math. But there was nobody in the school that could read her answer. They'd have to bring somebody from the outside who knew Nemeth to translate it. So this was kind of frustrating. So at a workshop, actually, that I held at University of Washington, she learned about LaTeX, which is a markup language for math. So she said, well, I know how to program. Why don't I just program a translator that will translate my Nemeth code to LaTeX? And then I can compile the LaTeX and print it. It'll be beautiful math. And so she did that as a high school student. I actually started a company and sold this product. So eventually she decided to go to college. She went to Stanford as a majored in computer science. She graduated about a year ago, and I met her this last summer at Google, where she's an engineer. Now, she doesn't work on accessibility at Google. She's just a regular engineer at Google. But she empowered, because of her knowledge of programming, it empowered her to solve an accessibility problem. Not her accessibility problem, it was her teacher's accessibility problem, that the teacher didn't know Nemeth code. I thought I'd just show you this one slide, which kind of demonstrates all of it. At the very top is the Nemeth code. It's annotated by somebody that knows it. There's the math. In the second line, it's the sort of Nemeth code as an ASCII sequence. There's the translation to LaTeX, and finally it gets compiled into that beautiful math. So at the end of her math course, she was turning in not her math late, but her math on time, and the most beautiful math in the class. So I just want to say one more thing. I'm going to stop here. That I have this project called Access Computing, and I have some brochures here that I'd like to pass out. So I'll do that when I'm done, while the next setup is going on, unless people have some questions.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Really inspiring. And maybe while you take a quick question, Massimo could come up. Questions?
No questions.
Okay, Massimo. Right here. Thank you. Massimo Bergamasco from Pisa will tell us about pure form.
You have the adapter? Yeah. I don't know the Mac. Sure. Yeah, here we go. Connect it here. Let me connect it. Okay, you put that in. Just be careful. Any audio? No.
It's okay. Should be okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I want to thank, first of all, Dr. Andrea Bocelli, Professor Laura Geré, and Professor Biancalani, and also Dr. Olimpia Angeletti of the Andrea Bocelli Foundation for the invitation to this event. the concept of the Museum of Pure Form has been conceived in 1993 as a technological installation for art museums, but after its implementation in different museums in Europe, at present has become an integrated framework for the study of the integration of haptic, visual, and auditory modalities in virtual environments, thus widening the application domains and the research fields to, for example, perception of the self, cognitive and motor neurorehabilitation, other than cultural heritage, as you will see today. As you know, the perceptual world created by our senses and by the central nervous systems is a functional representation of the physical world, and this means that the contact with the physical world is mediated. And the phenomenal world, being a construction of our senses and by the central nervous systems, is what we are aware of through the perceptual processes. That means that there is evidence of this. For example, if you consider the perception of the body, you know, the phenomenological body doesn't correspond always with the physical body. For example, if you consider the experiments on the phantom limb phenomenon, or also scientific literature dealing with brain injuries and psychopathologies supports this thesis. So the largest part of our perceptual experience, although originated by the stimulation of our sensory organs, is referred to an external space beyond the limits of our sensory organs. When dealing with virtual environments allow us to doubt about the assumption that the physical world and the perceptual world are the same thing. And in virtual environments, the interaction process between the human being and the virtual environment requires that we should address the design of an interface system capable of generating adequate stimuli to the human user and also acquiring her actions towards the virtual environment in a bilateral way. Virtual environments are computer-generated simulations of objects or events in a 3D virtual space. They are called virtual realities, virtual worlds, as you like, but they can be nowadays experienced in what we call immersive virtual environments, where the person is exposed to real-time generated artificial visualizations that covers the whole of our field of view. Clearly, the simulated world does not exist as a world anywhere in the computer or in the program, but only inside the consciousness of the subject, whose brain is confronted with coherent information to several sensory channels, and whose actions, for example, moving the hand or gazing around, are tracked by the computer and used in updating the images in a way corresponding to the movements. So here, at present, in virtual environment, a great emphasis is given to the visual modality. However, there is a growing interest in studying also haptics modality and auditory components. For a virtual environment system, to generate a complete immersion means also to modulate the phenomenological level in such a way to generate a fully convincing experience of the self in the world. And when you take into account other sensory modalities other than visions, for example, touch or haptics or you have to think on how interaction is achieved and also how autonomy of the behavior of the virtual entities is controlled. By entering into the topic of the presentation, you know that in the course of the centuries, the world of art has always been the first context in which new technologies has been exploited, and also virtual environment is not an exception to this. Artists, as you know, are extremely keen to explore new forms of expression, especially in contemporary art, where since the second half of the last century, so-called installations or performances often integrate the use of the technological equipment. Virtual environment have been exploited in several forms in the field of cultural heritage. The virtual reconstruction of the Campo Santo Monumentale in Pisa represents a vivid example of the use of the virtual environment in the field of cultural heritage. Here, the immersion of the user, of the observer, is traveling not only in space, but also according to time, because it is possible to show where frescoes, for example, were exactly located before the Second World War event that destroyed a large part of them. New trends of, in the field of cultural heritage comprehend a strong interest in the digitalization of architectural or work of art for 3D, three-dimensional virtual representations. So this brings this kind of activity to the creation of computer archives or repositories, virtual repositories of works of art and of heritage objects. And this is clearly an interesting aspect for blind or low-sighted persons. And so there is the need to create new paradigms of interaction with the art of work in these forms, based on sensor modalities that are different from vision, from sight. Well, in the framework of the interaction with virtual environments, we started the design of haptic interfaces in the forms of wearable robots at the beginning of the 1990s, and we call these systems robotic exoskeletons. They are a particular kind of robots that can be worn by the user at the level of the upper limb or the lower limb, and they are moved, and they move in order to follow the movements exerted by the user. And according to the design, they can leave a natural movement to the user's limb and also provide, for example, for the upper limb, gravity compensation throughout the workspace. Being these systems actuated and sensorized, these exoskeletons can assist the user's limb or can selectively generate specific patterns of movements to the joints, and for these reasons have been recently, in the last decade, strongly utilized in motor neurorehabilitation of the upper limb or the low, and also to recovery the gait function for the lower limb for the elderly. But what does it happen when exoskeletons, for example, like this, are used in order to interact with virtual environments? Clearly, they are used to control the movement of the virtual arm or the hand to perform a specific task, for example. Here, the virtual hand is exploring a geometrical surface, and when collision is detected between the virtual hand and the virtual object, a force is detected, and the exoskeleton works as an haptic interface. That means that it performs a constraint to the movement of the user's arm, and consequently, the user feels the presence of the virtual object. See, the virtual force vector is replicated to the user's hand by controlling an equivalent force at the exoskeleton and effector. Yes? 3 minutes? 5 minutes, okay. And clearly such an exploratory procedures can be performed also with eye-blinded, and this fact emphasizes the role of an haptic interface performed by the exoskeleton. We developed also tactile effectors in order to be able to replicate spatial and spatiotemporal patterns at the level of the fingertips skin, and this has been integrated also on sensorized glove. But clearly today the degree of interaction has been increased and it is possible to implement very sophisticated exploratory procedures of virtual objects, for example, the perception of the texture of a virtual textile, by using this kind of hand exoskeletons integrated with tactile effectors at the level of the thumb and of the index fingertips. Well, the concept of the museum of pure form, based on our initial experience in 1990s, this experience brought us to conceive the idea of the museum of pure form. The aim was to introduce a new paradigm of interaction between the user and the work of art, such as, for example, a sculpture, in which the visitor of a museum can interact with a three-dimensional digital copy of a sculpture, not only by sight, but through the haptic modality. And clearly, this has been funded in a framework of a European Union funded project in 2000. And the activities of the project included different phases. The first clearly was a phase of digital acquisition of the sculptures belonging to different museums in Europe. And the collection of digital sculptures formed a virtual repository available on the web, to which clearly the different museums belonging to the project can access. Then we designed, as you will see, different installations in the sites of the European museums involved in the project that opened the visits to usual visitors and their collections. The phase of acquisition of the models of the sculptures has been done by 3D laser scanning techniques, and clearly sculptures are not physically present in the installation of the Museum of Pure Form. They are a copy acquired by this kind of technique. And clearly, once acquired the point cloud, this should be processed in order to reduce the complexity of the meshes that usually have millions of triangles in order to be reduced to be successfully used for the graphical and haptic rendering in real time. Here you see in different museums, for example, this is an example of the acquisition at the Centro Gallego di Arte Contemporanea in Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and we created a virtual gallery of all these aspects. And another interesting application was the fact of applying haptic rendering algorithms that are needed in order to generate a profile of forces associated to a specific 3D shape that allow to enhance the contact sensation with the surface of the sculpture, a sort of force modeling to enhance haptic perception of shape. And here clearly we have generated also a haptic database corresponding to each component of the virtual graphic repository. Clearly we developed also collision detection modules in real time, and we have done several installations in the different museums, and for each installation the haptic component can have different design. I want to show you, since I have no time, some applications in different museums. This is the installation, which is was a permanent installation until last year at the Museo dell'Opera Primaziale in Pisa. You see the user, the visitor, is able to control the movement or with these fingers of these two robots that are able, and with the fingers is controlling the cursor, touching the virtual sculptures, and based on this collision between the cursor and the sculpture, this force virtual force is generated and replicated by the robot. So the user is feeling the presence of something that constrains the movement, so is able to perform a contour following operation of the sculpture. We have done this in different museums. In particular, this is the installation at the National Museum in Stockholm, in Sweden, at UCL, University College London, in London, UK, and Centro Gallego di Arte Contemporanea in Spain. And this is in our laboratory. You will see how in an immersive virtual environment, by using an app and the exoskeleton, it is possible to perform in real time the contour following operations. Clearly can be used in different other domains, for example. And I would like to show here some other applications of augmented realities technologies we are developed in order to transfer. We are trying to develop virtual environments, robotic systems for acquiring, digitally represent, and also transferring skills from one person to the other. And by means of augmented reality, the skilled person, the one on the right, is able to transfer very simply, with simple gestures, the movements to the non-expert at the left. She has only to follow in a natural way all the movements performed by the skilled person, and this clearly can be done also remotely in a geographically remote operation. So technology can be exploited in order to help people to perform different, even complex operations. So I just want to conclude by I conclude about I believe the transformational value of virtual environments is extremely interesting, since virtual environment can provide tools for modifying the content of the subjective experience. And the haptic component of the virtual environment system can be utilized also for blind or low-sighted person to experience virtual shapes or contacts with other persons located away. And the Museum of Pure Form can be considered as a framework for studying haptics and even auditory perception in virtual environments. We believe virtual environment can be an interesting technology to develop, to study empathy or compassion, since you can feel in the shoes of another person. And in the future, we believe that the strong value of virtual environment can be intended as a commodity for research activities in different domains, including clearly neuroscience, cognitive science, philosophy, psychology, and possibly a new era of artificial intelligence and robotics. I wish to thank all the people of the lab working with myself. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Massimo. Okay, let's take a brief question for our final speaker. Questions? All right, we did have a 20-minute coffee break scheduled, but we have run far behind our schedule. So let's take a 5-minute coffee break and reconvene for the panel. Please, everyone get a drink, coffee, stretch your legs, and we'll come back in 5 minutes. Thank you. Yes, of course, but it's in principle you can have everything. one museum with everything. Well, let's check. Thank you.
You're welcome, sir.
Thank you. It's great stuff. Well, yeah, let's just check with
Okay.
Windsor.
How many mics you gonna need up here?
Probably 5.
The 5? Oh, he's coming now. Okay.
2, 4, 5. This way I put pressure on people.
Okay, io sono qua. Iniziamo a decadere rapidamente, addormentarci rapidamente. No, 5 minuti ce la possiamo fare, perché è un'autonomia che
I think we can wait.
Va bene. Oh, how are you? Nice to see you again.
The only three will speak, and you will answer questions if you have something.
Okay.
It's a strange kind of discussion. But
Va bene, sono americano.
You're gonna speak in Italian?
Un po', sì, forse poche parole.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I enjoy the music.
Yeah.
A couple of words.
Buongiorno, buonanotte, buonasera.
Arrivata dopo l'altro workshop, sei stata lì per un po'. E anche io sono scappato dopo, è cominciato un po' tardi, sì.
Almeno prima lo stavamo facendo, sempre sul sito dell'Andrea Bocelli Foundation,
Sì.
non si vedeva, nell'Italia erano diversi l'anno.
Ho cercato di portare anche lui, ora forse viene, ma era un po' stanco.
Sì, sì. C'era ancora l'ambasciatore?
No, era andato via.
Il giorno ha cominciato un po' presto oggi.
Sì,
Forse
tipo
la notte anche
loro
di
4:30 si sono alzati che erano a
a
Toronto.
Toronto, sì. E stasera vola.
Stasera vola, domani ha un concerto da Vegas.
Oggi.
Quindi ha detto forse mi riposo un po'.
Poi quando tornate? Domani. Domani pomeriggio. Una giornata tranquilla.
Selma is socializing.
Una bella mostra, credo, di saggia in quel
Museum Fine Arts. Non lo so, io adesso non so se hai visto, sono qua con un ragazzo giovane che è mio nipote. No, perché sono fatto turista. Infatti siamo un po' saliti, abbiamo una macchina, domani pensavo di portarli un po' in ordine, sostanzialmente a mangiare l'oste a mezzogiorno e poi la sera però se arrivi qua
Okay, and then we exactly have half an hour, so
portare fedele il tuo bel grembiulino di plastica, però posso essere felice. Ti porti a casa questo ricordo proprio tipico della zona.
yeah, but that's 20 minutes.
Let's start, otherwise. Oh, here they are.
Okay, please take your seats. We're going to get started. Wow, that sounds like really... You wanna- Okay, that's fine. Yeah, okay. Okay. Everything's okay. Thank you. Okay, we can get started. This is the last session of this workshop. It has been an invigorating workshop, listening to a lot of interesting talks covering a diverse set of topics and things related to assistive technology for the blind. This particular session, which is about 30 minutes, we're going to focus on talking about interdisciplinary research, kind of creating a paradigm shift for helping visually, sort of challenged people. And I think we have a great panel for talking about this. So we're going to, it's a short period of time. We only have 30 minutes. We have a lot of people in the panel. So we're only going to hear from the people that did not speak for each 5 minutes each, and then we're going to open it up for questions so that we can get some of your input and some of the responses of the panelists. So the first speaker will be Professor Vicky from Università di Pavia, and he'll speak for 5 minutes about sleep, I think. No.
No?
No.
I'm not a sleep
Not the
person.
sleep, the second person, sorry.
I'm not a sleep person. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you and to all the people who have the energy to stay all day and to enjoy this beautiful meeting we had today. And I do feel that the main, what we all gain from the experience of today is to understand that it's like a big puzzle. We are a lot of people, most of us are working in different areas with different tools, with different procedures, different perspectives, but it's really like a puzzle. So everyone is a little piece, but we cannot miss all the other. So we have here, today we had a cognitive neuroscientist, we have a psychologist, and I am part of this group, and we are all trying to see how the brain works, how the brain is neurophysiological and neuroanatomically designed, and how this structure may lead to cognitive function, how they are shaped. Then we have engineers, and we have information technology, ICT, and all like that. And all these people basically also gave us another perspective, that is what we are able to do, how we can use technology, what kind of technology is now, presently, available in order to develop tools, develop something that may be helpful. And so we have to assistive learning, to assisted techniques. So what can we do? It's like putting together all the pieces. How is the brain? How is cognitive process? How technology can help us to address all the issues. Now I've been told that my role here should be to pose some questions and also to arise some ideas about what is possible to do. And what I feel from a psychological perspective, I'm a psychologist here, so my role is really to try to understand what we are missing in terms of how to understand the brain and how blindness can help us to understand the brain and how this could help blind people. I do feel that what we are missing are tools in order to understand what's the difference between blind people and sighted people. We normally use tools that have been designed for the sighted. We don't have tools that have been designed for the blind. And so there are many difficulties in really using the same tools for both populations. Because sometimes you you do feel that there are differences, you do feel there are limitations, but this is often not the case. It's just a matter that we are not able to understand these differences. And this is particularly evident when we consider the development of blind children. Because in this case, you really do not have the possibility to understand. We talk a little bit today about learning disabilities. There was a question about how to diagnose dyslexia in blind people. What does it mean? The problem is that you don't have the tools to do this. And also you have to consider that children now are children that really need to be evaluated in a different manner if you compare to 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So we have seen presentation about games, we have seen presentation about many different tools that are really impossible not to consider if you want now to test a children in its development, if you want now to develop something that must be useful for the next 10 years or 15 years. So we need the collaboration of information technology, we need the collaboration of computer programmers, we need the collaboration of all the people that can help us in developing tools, but at the same time these tools must be really effective in order to measure cognitive abilities in blindness, so to understand how they work and what we are able and capable to measure. So I feel that this could be the idea of putting together the energy. Is like a puzzle. Everyone has to do a little bit, and all together we can try to address the big question that have been presented early this morning. So there is a dream, could be considered a dream in order to help people to see even if they have problems with this. And in order to reach this dream, we have to, little by little, to add pieces. And one of the pieces could be, in principle, to evaluate what they are doing and to have the best possible tool in order to do the job. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Vicky. The next speaker is Professor Faraguna from Pisa.
Good evening. And first of all, thank you to the organizers for this very inspiring workshop. I am a sleep researcher. I study sleep, and the topic of my research is trying to understand why we need to sleep, and every animal actually does need to sleep. And you might be wondering, what am I doing here? And the topic is rather different, of course. And the reason why I'm here is to try to propose a shift in the paradigm, as the moderator mentioned before. I have to thank for this opportunity a sister foundation in Italy, a sister foundation of the ABF, which is the ARPA foundation that allowed me to be here to participate in this new field for me. What can sleep research bring to this very different topic? With some collaborators, we have a question. And the question is, do congenitally blind people visually dream? And this might sound something strange, something odd. And there are actually already some lines of evidence that this is the case. And this is not only an interesting and intriguing question in terms of understanding how the brain generates images without experiencing the external world, but it can be a very relevant question also in terms of therapeutic approaches. We have heard that in the world there are more than 300 million people who are blind, and 4% of them are congenitally blind. And most of them are excluded by default from implants, because the assumption is that they've never seen, so there is no point about implanting them. But if we are able to study with electrophysiology, and my background is electrophysiology, the topography of visual dreams, we might be able to proves that actually the brain of congenitally blind people is actually completely functional, and therefore this can open the path towards central implants that are becoming available. So on one side, this would help understanding how the brain works, and on the other side, it can actually include those people who are excluded right now, and they represent 4% of a very significant population. We are talking about almost 15 million people. So I think in this multidisciplinary approach, sleep research can actually serve as a new window to investigate how the brain works and to help finding and applying new therapeutical approaches. And I thank again for the organization of this workshop, because between yesterday and today I had the chance to talk with many experts and to verify the feasibility of this project. And thank you again.
Thank you, Professor Faraguna. This is actually a very interesting connection, and I'm sure it will generate quite a bit of questions in the questioning period. Next, Paul Paravano from MIT will speak as well about new paradigms.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you this afternoon, and I don't want to miss an opportunity to provide a special welcome for our guests from Italy. Mi è fatto sono molto felice che voi siete con noi oggi qui a MIT. Mi ricordo i miei genitori che sono venuti qua da Italia, e con tutti i miei parenti ancora in Italia. Spero proprio di visitarvi tutti in Italia, e ti do a tutti oggi un grande abbraccio. Wow. So I have a unique opportunity for just a couple of minutes to comment a little bit on what great emphasis and focus I've heard today on technology that serves blind people. And one perspective that I wanted to mention at the beginning is that in my 20 years, more than 20 years working at MIT in the Office of the President here, it has been an interesting opportunity to view many technologies which have been offered to blind people, which have not always been terribly efficient, productive, or useful. Just the other day, I was asked to speak at an event at IBM here in Cambridge. And in the introduction, IBM talked a lot about the history of their involvement in technology for the blind. They talked about an electric Braille typewriter. They talked about an early screen reader. And I had to say in my remarks at IBM that neither one of those products were ones that were of value or of use to me. And I think that what's important about today, what is really unique about what Andrea Bocelli and his foundation have brought to us, is the opportunity to involve blind people in the design and the discussion about what kind of technology and research is most useful. And one of the best examples of this approach is Professor Teller's class, Principles and Practices of Assistive Technology, where his students meet with blind people to ask them about what their challenges are. What are the difficulties nowadays that blind people face? Because they're different. And blind people are different. We lose our sight at different stages in life, and our activities and work are different. So we have unique challenges, and it is important to focus on that concept. And every scientist that I've heard speak here today at this workshop has underscored the idea that blind people should be involved and engaged in the design and discussion about each product. So it is very important and enlightening and exciting to me that important part of what Andrea Bocelli has designed and put before us is the challenge that blind people should be part of the process and should not be merely handed technology that somebody thought might be a good idea. Many of us who are blind have been given laser canes, electronic canes, all kinds of technology that were not always well suited to what our challenges are. For me, the challenges are all about basic access to digital information. I think one of the challenges here today that I've heard and that I strongly agree with is that we have to we have to focus on what some of the key issues are. And for me, it is for a blind child, when Andre this morning talked to us about the 6-year-old child who was facing the world as a blind child, what is the most important activity that children learn first? It's learning how to read, learning how to be literate, learning how to write, learning how to express themselves. And for me, that ability came through Braille. My father made a small piece of wood with 6 holes in it, gave me 6 marbles, and taught me Braille. Braille allowed my world to blossom. And I think that it is important to think about as we consider the ways in which blind people interact with the rest of the world. I believe that Braille is part of literacy for blind people to be able to read and write. And in my view, and again, this is just my view, that's what I've been asked to give, it is much harder to imagine that only audio can be the focus of how blind people are educated and how they express themselves. The last item I want to focus on is affordability. The amazing thing about what Andrea Bocelli has brought us today is a workshop on the challenges that blind people face and the challenge that most of the world is poor and unable to afford much of the technology that we have here today. I don't have to tell this audience that the electronic Braille device that I have with me here today cost $7,000. That is shameful when we have the ability to produce technology, but a small market that cannot help drive down the price. We need to think also, please, about the economics of technology and how blind people around the world can gain better access to Braille devices and the other technology that we're talking about here today. So I would urge you to make sure that that's a part of the equation as you go forward and think about technology opportunities that will serve blind people in their opportunities to be employed, to be educated, and to be members of our society. I am blessed to have 2 wonderful daughters and a wife and an opportunity to work to serve the community here at MIT. And it is simply a great joy to have all of you join us today on our campus for this important topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. We will take questions right now from the audience as well as from the panel if there are some questions, but we'll start with the audience. Actually, I have a question to warm it up for the panel. How should we set our expectations in terms of how quickly this research is going to produce a gadget, a device that is practical and helpful?
Domani.
Tomorrow. What about the research community? What do you feel about that? Because I think expectations is a very important thing. Yes, please.
So
insurance reimbursement. My understanding is that insurance generally does not reimburse for assistive technology. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that's the case. And what do you... Sure. So the question is, if it's correct that insurance companies generally do not provide assistive technology, what can be done in order to change that? Because that's something that will get the production of these devices to the volume you may need, which will then drive the price down. And also the more users you get and the more people will provide feedback, and we can then improve the technology based on iterating the versions of the technology. So first of all, is it correct about the lack of reimbursement for assistive technology? If so, what are the challenges that are facing that?
I'll begin, but this answer is going to be a little bit different, I think, in the United States than it is in Italy. Here, one of the opportunities you have is through the tax code. You're allowed every year to put aside some reimbursement funding through your employer that's tax-free. So that's one option that you have. But most insurance companies, unless they're prescribed by your doctor, are probably not going to reimburse you for technology that you need for work. If you need it for living, for reasons of, for medical reasons or for living or for getting around, then there might be that opportunity. But for the work technology that I'm talking about that's so unaffordable, the insurance companies are not going to reimburse you for that. Some employees might be able to, and some states might have that opportunity. I'm not sure what the opportunity is in Italy.
Okay.
Well, I cannot really answer. I don't know exactly all the situation in Italy. I know that some of the insurance companies may reimburse also this technology, but it really depends on the kind of insurance that you have. You cannot think of this as a general possibility that you have. In some cases, is it possible? In most cases, I feel it is not.
I think that the other question this raises is if the market can't help drive down the price of technology, what is the role of, and I'm not advocating for this, but what should be the role of philanthropy? What should be the role of government in supporting both the research and the availability and provision of the technology to the end user? Those are all questions that I think we really need to think about.
All right. Any other questions? Andrea, do you have questions?
No, now I have to think very well to everything that I heard, and next year I will bring my question.
Okay, fair enough. Other? Yeah?
If you want to answer to Munzer's question, when do you want something?
No, in case I would like to make a smaller reflection. Okay, I tell in Italian because it's easier for everybody. L'unica cosa, ecco, per rispondere, per dare un contributo a questa discussione, riguarda i costi.
I wanted to give a contribution to this discussion about the costs of the devices.
È probabile che io dica una cosa abbastanza impopolare, ma preferisco la sincerità alla popolarità.
I may be saying something that it's not quite popular, but I prefer to be sincere rather than looking for popularity at all costs.
Io ritengo che in tutta onestà quando si fa ricerca non ci si debba mai preoccupare dei costi.
I believe, to be sincere, that when you do research, you must never worry about the costs.
L'importante è raggiungere lo scopo, cioè raggiungere quelle conoscenze necessarie a risolvere un problema.
I think the important thing to do is to reach the goal, to reach the purpose, the end purpose of your research.
Il resto viene da sé, step by step.
And the rest will come step by step.
C'è una frase idiomatica inglese
There is an idiom in English
che spiega questo. Voi in inglese dite where there is a will, there is a way.
that explains this very well. As you say in English, where there's a will, there's a way.
Per esempio, oggi andare nello spazio è estremamente costoso.
For instance, nowadays, to go up into space, it's quite expensive.
Però qualcuno può andarci e col tempo sarà sempre maggiore il numero di coloro che ci possano andare.
Somebody can afford it and go up there, but in time it will become more and more affordable and more people will be able to go up into space.
E grazie al fatto che tanti anni fa venivano montate sulle Rolls Royce l'aria condizionata e i vetri elettrici, grazie a questo fatto oggi anche sulle macchine più economiche ci sono questi vantaggi.
And you know, years and years ago, there was air conditioning that was installed into a Rolls Royce. Nowadays, even very basic cars have air conditioning.
Quindi il mio invito a tutti gli scienziati dell'MIT e non soltanto a loro è quello di procedere approcciare le scoperte, trovare le soluzioni. Noi poi penseremo a far abbassare i costi.
So my invitation to the scientists here at MIT is go ahead with your research work, and then we will think and we will do something about lowering the cost of these devices.
Good luck.
Thank you, Andrea. Okay, we have time for one more question or comment from the audience, but maybe a question to the panel. Yes, please.
Thank you. This is Richard LADNER from University of Washington. This was a very interesting conference for me because of the diversity of projects and ideas. I never saw so many brain scans in my life. It's kind of cool. I honestly couldn't understand them. I had to trust you for your interpretations, but I would like somebody to speak to connecting the dots. So if you have all this brain research, how is that going to lead to better products, better services for blind people? How do you connect those dots? Thank you.
That's a great question. Anyone from the panel? You want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, I know very little about that brain research myself. Is this on? Yes. But I know that people, for instance, at Smith Kettlewell who are working on, thank you, fMRI. Oh, it's on. fMRI imaging of blind people learning shapes, for instance, two-dimensional shapes, and I think their experiments planned in 3 dimensions. The hope is that these kinds of experiments will shed light on, understanding what's going on, and sort of understanding more the fundamentals. I mean, of what a blind person does in interacting with the environment. And a lot of the research that, for instance, I'm working on is very, very task-driven. And I think there are some advantages and disadvantages to that. If you're focusing more on the sort of fundamentals of the brain research, I think the hope is that it might provide more insights that could, at some point, lead to innovations. That's an extremely broad answer. I'm not very well informed on fMRI, but since someone asked me, I thought I'd give my opinion.
Just one of the things I want to comment, even though it's not my area of expertise, is one of the things I've seen succeed in research is connecting policy with the technical research that you're doing. And I think that potentially creating a challenge problem and creating a buzz around it for more funding for people to compete on that challenge problem will allow us to first bring in teams that are multidisciplinary and then also push the boundaries for technology. I think this kind of a workshop is sort of the seed for bringing those people together. It would be fantastic if groups from this workshop kind of combine their effort to create a challenge problem, create a buzz to get more funding, not just from philanthropy, but from government and industry, and sort of push the boundaries for that research. That's how multidisciplinary research happens. Otherwise, it's very difficult for us individually to connect the dots. Anyway, well, thank you so much. Oh, one more question. That was the last question, but.
So I certainly don't have an answer, but one thing I would love to see in terms of science and research is dispelling myths. I think a lot of what we do in terms of education and rehabilitation of the blind is based on decades of anecdotes. So for example, wayfinding or orientation and mobility, there's a thought that if you were born blind, you would be inherently at a disadvantage than someone who lost their sight later. Turns out that's not necessarily the case. Another example, if you learn language through Braille reading, are you at an advantage than someone who chooses not to be Braille literate, for example? So there are a lot of fundamental education and rehabilitation issues I think we should just try to put data to. And as scientists, engineers, and so on, we're very, very good at that. So we have the opportunity here to answer some really, really important questions and dispel myths, because we're just propagating these. And I think that's part of our jobs, to try to get a handle on that before we solve and cure blindness, obviously.
Thank you. Laura, you didn't speak. Do you want to say a final comment? No? No. Okay. Well, okay, one last question there. That's like the third last question.
Hello. Okay, so my name is Carlos Enriquez. I'm a freshman here at MIT, and this is more of asking for an opinion to the blind community that may be present here. So a group of freshmen and I, for our seminar, are working on a project where we're trying to create a haptic feedback glove that will allow you to sort of feel your way around mathematical relations. So if someone, like if you plug in a function that is, say, y equals x, the graph of y equals x squared, you can sort of put your hand into the sensor field of a leap motion, and the glove will vibrate whenever you're on what the graph of, say, for example, y equals x squared would be, so you can sort of feel your way around where the function would be. And I just wanted to pose the question as, do you guys think that this would help you in any way, like, to better understand mathematical relations, and would this be something of interest to you guys?
That's I'd have to think about that for a while. That's
it's an interesting, but it's a classical feedback problem that you're looking at. So I think that there's a lot of other complexities for the blind that don't arise in that formulation. So. Yeah.
Okay, Laura.
Okay. All right. Thanks for the comment, and thank you all for listening, and thanks to the panel, for a nice discussion. Veronica. The next speaker is Veronica. No introduction. Yeah, she will close today.
Vice President. Oh my God.
Oh.
Ladies and gentlemen, authorities, speakers, and guests, the time has come to close our day of reflection, exchanges, and bonds. And as a Vice President, I will simply like to add a few things and thank you all. Today, the great goal achieved by the Andrea Bocelli Foundation and by the MIT has been to lay the foundation for construction of a network, a powerful network made above all of people who want to get involved and build, because the time has come to build together. I have the privilege of living with Andrea, and the things that he has taught me are not to be afraid, always face everything with perseverance, work together to build, and have confidence in the other, that are the values through which we intend to work with the ABF, the 5 C's. Courage, believing in small or big changes that we carry out. Courage of giving life to something true. Courage of being confident and transmitting confidence. Care, caring about people around us and understanding their problems and the extent of their distress. Concreteness, work to offer real solution to the problems that we care about. Competence, work professionally and with responsibility and responsibly. Cooperation, enable positive relationship between donors foundation and foundation to beneficiary. Putting together the needs with the will to meet them. The key value that summarize our 5 C's is trust. The trust we give and we trust we ask for. The trust we inspire and the trust we live with. As you can see, even today, Andrea Bocelli Foundation carry out 2 programs. Challenges and break the barriers. Giving great importance to research, fighting poverty, we integrate research with action, and the time of the analysis need of of needs, and at that time of the assessment of the action impact. This is what we could make all our effort more effective in trying to change and improve, even if partially, the world. Finally, I would like to thank on behalf of the Andrea Bocelli Foundation, the MIT, and its president, Rafael Raif, and all the people who have been supporting us in these 2 weeks stay in Boston. Thanks to Jeff Newton, Carol Holliday, and all their staff for their support and their continued involvement. Thanks to the Ministry of the Foreign Affairs, the Italian Embassy in Washington, Ambassador Bisogniero, and for the Italian Consulate in Boston, the Consul Joseph Pastorelli. Thanks to the Italian University of Pisa, Florence, and to the Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna who sponsored the initiative. Thanks also to the University of Palermo, Venezia, and Milano Bicocca. Thanks to the professor and the researchers who have come from Italy and from all over the United States. And last but not least, thanks to all of you who are here at the MIT, as well as the following us online. You make us think that the path we have taken is the right one for the ABF, a common house open to the world with important goals in the field of research and in the fight against poverty. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you to everybody, and see you next year, maybe, somewhere.
Yeah.